Quirkless, get the fuck out of here. Gigantomachia charged at him and met a wall of living wood that drank his shit dry. He put a root through Shigaraki's head, then stood in front of All for One, ripped every single quirk out of his body one by one, while the bastard screamed, and put a root through his stupid ass. Absolute cinema.
Welcome, legends, to Chronos Recom. I wrote this story myself, so if you have any suggestions or what-ifs you want to see, drop it in the comments below. Also, just wanted to let you know I've got a Patreon set up now for anyone who wants to support the channel directly. You can get early access to stories, submit direct fan requests, and get exclusive content. It's totally optional, but if you want to help keep these stories coming, check it out. Links in the description. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit that bell so you never miss an upload. Let's dive into this story.
The street split open at 3:14 in the afternoon, and it split the way a log splits. One long shriek, then a gap. Musutafu had earthquakes. Everyone did. This was something else. This was a fault line that had been sleeping under the residential district for 11,000 years, waking up all at once, and it came up through the asphalt in a jagged line that ran 4 blocks and swallowed a parked delivery truck whole. The truck went down nose first and kept going. Nobody heard it land. Izuku Midoriya was carrying 2 bags of groceries and holding her son's hand when the world stopped being reliable. The apartment block across the street folded. Not sideways. Down, like someone had pulled a chair out from under it, 6 floors of concrete pancaking into a cloud that came at them like weather. Glass rained. A telephone pole snapped at the base and swung, and the wires went live and whipped across the road, throwing sparks the size of dinner plates. Heroes were already there. That was the thing people forgot later. 3 of them, and one was Death Arms, and he had a woman under each arm, and he was running, and there was nothing in his body or his quirk or his training that had any answer for the ground itself deciding to leave. Backdraft was hosing down a gas main. Somewhere above, Mount Lady was standing at 40 meters with her hands out and her face wrecked because she could hold a building, sure, and there were 9 of them coming apart, and she had 2 arms. Get back! Death Arms was screaming. Everyone back, the ground was still moving. That was the part. You could stop a villain. You could punch a monster. There was no fist in the world you could put into a tectonic plate. Izuku Midoriya was 6 years old. He had a plastic action figure in his pocket and grass stains on both knees, and he was crying because he was 6. He was 6, and the noise was enormous, and his mother's hand was crushing his fingers, and somewhere in the dust, a man was shouting a woman's name over and over. But he was crying while he knelt down. Inko felt him pull free, and turned and screamed his name, and her son was on his knees in the middle of a road that was coming apart. With both palms flat on the asphalt, head down, shoulders shaking. He had felt this before. He had felt it his whole life, the way other children felt hunger. Under the concrete, under the pipes, under the sewer lines, and the clay and the bedrock, there was something huge and slow and alive, and it had been pushing against the inside of his hands since the day he was born. Water down there, earth down there, both braided, waiting for permission. He pressed harder. He sobbed once, and he said one word into the road. Grow. Everything after that took 4 seconds. The first pillar came up through the intersection and took the traffic light with it. A column of oak 11 meters across, bark like the hide of something prehistoric, and it kept coming. 40 meters, 60, and it caught the falling face of the apartment block on its flank and just held it there, the whole collapsing wall leaning against wood like a drunk against a lamppost. The second and third came up on either side of the fault and hooked over it. Then the roots. The roots came out of the fault line. They came out of the crack in the earth like something breathing out, thicker than subway cars. And they went down, threading into the split layer over layer, weaving it closed the way fingers lace together. The screaming under the ground stopped. The shaking stopped. It did not fade. It stopped, like a hand had come down on a struck bell. And then the street bloomed. Trees erupted through the rubble in a wave that ran out 4 blocks in every direction. Cherry, oak, camphor, cedar, hundreds of them, tearing up through the asphalt with a sound like applause, and vines caught the broken telephone wires and pinned them harmlessly to bark, and moss ran up the sides of the buildings that were left, and a canopy closed over the whole district and turned the afternoon light green. Silence. Absolute. Birds somewhere. Already. Which made no sense at all. Death Arms stood in a forest that had been a residential street. He had a civilian under each arm. He was standing on grass. He looked down at the grass. He looked up at a canopy 60 meters over his head, at sunlight coming through leaves, at a pillar of oak the width of a house holding an apartment block off the ground like a shelf. At the center of it, in a small clearing that the trees had left open around him, a 6-year-old boy was sitting on his heels, crying, with both hands still flat on the ground and a cherry tree blossoming over his head. Inko got to him first. She always would. She fell over him and grabbed him, and he turned his wet face up into her shoulder and said, "The ground was hurting, Mom," in a small, hiccuping voice, and she had absolutely nothing to say to that. So she just held on. Mount Lady shrank down to human size in a side street and threw up. The footage ran for 9 days. They called it the Musutafu Bloom because the news needed a name, and a child sealed a tectonic fault with trees tested badly. There were 17 camera angles. There was a helicopter shot that became the most watched 30 seconds of video in Japan for 2 years. The district going green from the inside out, spreading, a forest arriving like a flood in reverse. Casualties, 0. Structural loss, 11 buildings, most of them held upright by wood and later reinforced around it, because the city engineers took one look at the pillars and decided they would sooner remove a mountain. Property value in the district tripled inside a year. People moved there to live under the canopy. Someone put up a shrine at the base of the largest oak and nobody ever took it down. The academics lost their minds. Quirk classification is a system, and systems work by fitting things into boxes, and Izuku Midoriya was a shape the boxes had never been built for. Emitter, obviously. But emitters cost their users something, and he had spent 4 seconds reforesting 6 hectares and then eaten a whole plate of katsudon. Creation type, then. Except creation. Quirks needed raw material, and the wood was not converted from anything. It grew, it had rings, it had cells, and when they took samples, the cells were alive and dividing and had a chromosome count that made 3 separate labs recalibrate their equipment. Dr. Garaki-affiliated papers circulated, so did papers refuting them. A researcher at Kyushu published 40 pages arguing that the boy was drawing energy directly from ambient biomass and geothermal potential, which was correct, and which got her laughed out of 2 conferences before it got her a grant. Nezu read every paper. He kept a folder. He wrote a single line on the front of it in his terrible handwriting. Ask him what it feels like. Nobody did, for 9 years. Izuku, for his part, watched about 4 minutes of the coverage total. He was on the floor of the living room with a bowl of rice, and the anchor was saying words like unprecedented and paradigm, and Izuku said, "Mom, they're being so dramatic." And then he went outside to grow a treehouse. That was the whole of it. He was 6, then 8, then 12, and he never once had a crisis about what he was. He knew what his hands were for the way you know your own name. He grew orchards behind hospitals. He fixed a collapsed retaining wall in Shizuoka on a family trip and then apologized to the construction crew for taking their job. He cried at a school play. He cried at a dog with 3 legs. He laughed so loud in a movie theater that a man 2 rows up applauded him. Inko watched all of it from about half a step away, which is where she lived. She never fully understood him. That was the truth of their house. She loved him past the point where love has words. She made his lunches. She sewed his ridiculous armor when he asked for it at 13. She sat up with him the night he grew a plum tree in the middle of the kitchen because he had a bad dream about the ground hurting again. And sometimes she would come home and find her son sitting cross-legged in the backyard with his eyes closed and the grass around him standing up in a perfect ring, bent away from him like the air was too heavy there. And she would stand at the kitchen window with a dish towel in her hands and feel a very specific kind of vertigo. She had given birth to a boy. She was raising something the earth talked to. He would always look up and see her and light up like a festival lantern. "Mom, come sit." The dirt's happy today. And she would go sit because he was her son. And the dirt was happy. And what else are you supposed to do? He showed up to the UA entrance exam in armor, dark red, lacquered plate over the shoulders and chest, layered on top of black training clothes with wooden bracers he had grown himself that morning because he was running late and lost the real ones. He was 15. He was built like someone who did farm labor for fun. His hair was an absolute catastrophe of green, and he was laughing to himself as he came up the walk. Not at anything. He had remembered a joke his mother made in 2019. 200 applicants in reasonable tracksuits watched an armored teenager laugh at nothing and pointedly gave him space. You're going to get disqualified for that, someone offered. For being happy? Izuku said, delighted, and clapped the boy on the shoulder hard enough to stagger him. You should try it! He was so busy grinning at the gate that he walked directly into a girl. She staggered. He caught her elbow before she went down, which was reflex, and then he saw her hair and something happened to his whole face. Ibara Shiozaki had grown up being stared at. Vines instead of hair, thick, coiling, green, alive, and heavier than anyone imagined. Children had cried at her in supermarkets. She had made peace with it in the way you make peace with weather, through prayer and through practice, and she braced for whatever this loud, armored boy was about to say. Your hair, Izuku said, and his voice had gone soft and hushed, and his eyes were huge and shining. It's alive, she blinked. It's alive with nature. He said it like a man identifying a saint. I can feel it from here. There's chakra moving in it. Actual living chakra. It's growing right now while we're standing here. And his voice cracked, genuinely cracked, and he put a hand over his heart. That is the most beautiful thing I have seen all week, and I saw a heron on the way here. Ibara opened her mouth. Nothing came out. We should make the concrete jungle greener together, he said, with the absolute earnestness of a man proposing a national infrastructure plan. You and me. There's so much gray in this city, and it makes me so sad. We could fix it. Think about it. And then somebody dropped a water bottle behind him, and he turned to see if they were okay, and by the time he turned back, he had wandered 8 steps away and was talking to a boy with engine calves about the load-bearing capacity of the gate arch. Ibara stood in the middle of the walkway with her hands pressed flat against her cheeks, which had gone an interesting color, and one of her vines curled up on its own like it was embarrassed. Oh, she said to nobody. The practical exam was a mock city, and the mock city had a life expectancy of about 30 seconds. President Mech yelled start, and 200 kids sprinted through the gate, and Izuku Midoriya walked in, cracked his neck, looked up at 8 blocks of concrete and steel with faux brick storefronts and a robot problem, and made an expression his mother would have recognized as he's about to do something enormous. He put his hands together. The examiner booth had 32 monitors. In the space of one breath, every single one of them went to static, then to green. The ground went first, a shudder that ran the length of the testing zone and knocked half the applicants off their feet. Then it opened in a line, and the line ran, and out of it came the forest. It was not gentle. This was a tidal wall of timber 60 meters high, trunks the size of grain silos, and it came down the main avenue like an avalanche going the wrong direction. A 3-pointer got in the way of it and turned into a shower of bolts. Then 11 more did. The trees went through the mock buildings, up and out and over, and the roots came behind them and swept the side streets. A 2-pointer went up on a root and hung there like laundry before the vines crushed it into a cube. Somebody screamed. Somebody else screamed a different way. The way people scream at fireworks. 28 seconds. Point tallies stopped meaning anything at 28 seconds. Because the entire robot deployment in Battle Center B was under several thousand tons of hardwood, and the mock city was now a mock forest with a subway entrance sticking out of it at an angle. Applicants stopped running. All of them. 100+ teenagers stood in the wreckage of an urban environment they had planned to fight in, staring up through leaves, and one girl said, into total silence, "Do we still get points?" Izuku walked out of the tree line dusting his hands. "Sorry," he called out, cheerfully to everyone. "I got carried away. There's still some over on the east side. Go get them." Nobody moved. "Go on." He made a shooing motion. "I'll stay here." In the booth, Recovery Girl set her coffee down. Nezu had leaned so far forward in his chair that his feet had left it. "Note the time," he said pleasantly. "Note the time exactly. Someone's going to ask." "He didn't touch them," Snipe said. "He didn't touch one of them. He clapped." "He clapped," Vlad King agreed, in the voice of a man reevaluating his career. Then Ibara Shiozaki, 4 blocks east, ran out of road. She was good. That was the thing that nobody bothered to notice afterward. She was genuinely good. She had taken down 4 robots with vine constriction, and she had pulled 2 other applicants out of a collapsing overpass. And she was standing on the roof of a mock pharmacy with her lungs burning when the wall at the end of the street came apart. The 0-pointer was the height of an office building. It came through the block sideways, shoulder first, and it was designed to be run away from. And Ibara's exit had trees across it now, and the machine's sensor cluster turned and locked on her, and it raised an arm the size of a train car. She had time to pray. That was all. 4 blocks west, Izuku stopped smiling. It was fast, and it was total. His face went flat, the grin gone, the warmth gone, the eyes gone, somewhere cold and old, and the air pressure in a 50-meter radius rose enough that 3 applicants dropped to their knees with their ears popping. He bit his thumb. Blood came up. He dragged it across his palm and slammed his hand into the base of the nearest trunk. The seals ran up the wood in black lines. And the forest stood up. The wood golem came out of the ground in the middle of the exam zone, and it kept coming, and it kept coming. Shoulders like cathedral roofs, a face carved with a mouth open in a permanent shout, ancient and heavy-browed, the kind of face you find on things dug out of the ground and put behind glass. It rose until it was eye to eye with the 0-pointer, and it was bigger. The machine registered a new target. It swung, a full-weight hydraulic haymaker with 100 tons behind it, and the golem caught the fist out of the air. Wood groaned. Metal did something worse. Then the golem's other hand closed on the 0-pointer's shoulder joint and pulled, and the entire arm came out of the socket in a spray of coolant and torn cable. And the golem threw the arm 90 meters down the avenue where it went through a mock office building and out the other side. The robot pivoted to compensate. It never finished. The golem punched it once in the chest. The sound reached the observation booth before the shockwave did. The 0-pointer's entire torso caved inward. Armor plating folding like foil, internal frames snapping in a rolling series of cracks. And the machine came off the ground, all 40 meters of it, and skidded backward down the avenue on its back, breaking apart the whole way and slammed into the perimeter wall in 6 pieces. The dust took a while. Silence in Battle Center B. Silence in the observation booth. 32 monitors, and one of them just showed a hand. "I would like to state for the record," said Midnight very slowly, "that I have no notes." Ibara was on her knees on the pharmacy roof. She had watched the whole thing from 30 meters away with her arms over her head, and now she lowered them and she looked up. The golem was already going back down, sinking into the earth it came from, and coming down its shoulder, hand over hand, unbothered, one bracer missing, was the boy who had told her about her hair. He hopped the last 2 meters and landed on the street like a man stepping off a bus. He rolled his shoulder. He looked around at the ruin of the exam. Then he saw her, and he waved. "You're okay." Full volume. Both arms. "Oh, thank goodness. I felt your chakra move and I panicked. That was so scary. I nearly cried." He jogged over, and by the time he arrived, he was in fact crying. 2 clean tracks down a dusty face. "Are you hurt? Your hair? Is your hair okay? Don't scare me like that." Ibara looked at the crying boy. She looked over his shoulder at the 40-meter machine in 6 pieces. "You," she said carefully, "are extraordinary." He beamed so hard he had to close his eyes. They gave him a number nobody had ever gotten, and then had an argument about whether to publish it. Villain points, 174. Rescue points, 60, which was the ceiling. The judges added a footnote about environmental restoration exceeding the parameters of the assessment, which was Nezu's polite way of writing he built a park. Ibara Shiozaki placed 11th on merit. She was assigned to Class 1A. The staff meeting about that took 6 minutes. Aizawa argued for splitting them on the grounds that he did not want a class built around one student. Nezu tapped his teacup and said that the boy had gone from delight to a war footing in less than a second because a girl he had met for 90 seconds was in danger, and that he would rather that girl be in the same building, the same room, and ideally the same seating row for the rest of everyone's lives. Aizawa thought about it for a while. "Front row," he said, "where I can see them both." He got the seat behind her. Life is like that. For the first 2 weeks, Class 1A tried to figure out what to do with Izuku Midoriya, and failed, and settled into a permanent state of low-grade astonishment that would define their entire academic career. He was the friendliest person any of them had ever met, and by far the most alarming. He learned all 20 names in one afternoon and used them constantly. He hugged Kirishima in the hallway on day 3 for reasons Kirishima never explained. He listened to Ida's rules with total glowing attention and then broke 4 of them by lunch without malice because a bird got into the building and needed a tree. He told Yaoyorozu her quirk was a form of prayer and she went red to the collarbone. He wept openly at a documentary in modern hero art history. He wept again at a good lunch. And then in foundational hero studies on the 4th day, someone doubted the trees and he stopped smiling for 2 seconds, and a 100-meter cedar came out of the training field so fast the sonic report broke windows on the 3rd floor. "Sorry," he called up at the windows. "I'll fix those." Those. He fixed them with wood. The frames are still wood. The thing was, they liked him. That was what made it strange. There was nothing to resent in him. He never lorded it. He would spend 40 minutes coaching Uraraka on breathing and mean every word. He asked Tokoyami about his shadow with real curiosity, and Tokoyami, who had never met sincerity in the wild, ended up talking for an hour. He referred to the class, constantly and without irony, as the village. That's not what a class is," Ida said. "It's exactly what a class is," said Izuku and put a hand on his shoulder, and Ida found himself moved and could not identify why. The one exception, obviously, was Katsuki Bakugo. They had gone to the same middle school. There was a history there, and it was thin, and it was not the history canon might have written. Bakugo had never once made this boy afraid, because at 9 years old, Izuku had responded to being shoved by growing a hedge around him and then apologizing for it while Bakugo screamed inside the hedge for 11 minutes. That was the shape of their childhood. Bakugo attacked. Izuku made it stop and looked sad, and that was infinitely worse than winning. 6 years of that had wounded Katsuki Bakugo into a spring. So when the battle trial teams were drawn and Bakugo pulled hero side against Izuku on hero side, the exercise was 2-on-2, and Aizawa had sorted them into the same team on purpose, and the observation room would later agree this had been an experiment. Bakugo did what a spring does. He ambushed him in a 3rd-floor corridor before the timer even finished. "Oh," said Izuku, turning. Bakugo's palm was already at his chest. The explosion took out the corridor. It was a full-power detonation at point-blank range. Thermal and kinetic, and it blew the windows out down the entire east wall and rolled fire along the ceiling and blackened 40 feet of concrete. The observation feed whited out. Yaoyorozu said, "Bakugo!" The smoke pulled back. Izuku was standing in the middle of it, hair pushed back, one sleeve gone, absolutely unhurt. There were tiny curls of new bark closing over his forearm where the skin had cooked, and by the time the camera focused, it was skin again. And he looked devastated, his shoulders dropped. His whole face collapsed into an expression of such profound, mournful disappointment that Bakugo actually flinched. "Why are you always like this?" Izuku asked. It was not anger. That was what broke it. There was no fight in his voice at all. It was the exhausted, grieving tone of a man who has been asking the same question since he was 9 years old and has stopped expecting an answer. He spread his hands. "We're on the same team. We're supposed to be, I made you a bento. It's in my bag. I made you a bento because I thought..." Bakugo fired again. The second one was bigger. He put both palms in it. Izuku's face went to stone. Wood style, Hobie technique. The dome came up around him in a quarter of a second. Layered wood, plate over plate, dense enough that the grain looked like stone, and at every joint a dragon's face, carved, snarling, mouths open. The explosion hit it and stopped. There was no flex. There was no crack. Fire wrapped the dome and went nowhere and died, and the corridor filled with the smell of scorched cedar. And inside the dome, Izuku Midoriya stood with his eyes shut and his hands together. The dome opened like a flower. Izuku stepped out through the smoke, and he was moving with the unhurried directness of a man who had already finished this fight in his head 3 seconds ago and was now doing the physical paperwork to go through a right hand. Izuku caught the wrist. He pivoted. One turn of the hips, that was all, and Katsuki Bakugo went off his feet over and down into the concrete floor hard enough that a crack ran out from his shoulder blades to both walls. The air left him. The room stopped. Izuku crouched over him. He was close enough that Bakugo could see there was nothing triumphant in his face. There was just weight. "Whenever you live, there will always be war," Izuku said. He said it plainly. No heat, no performance. It was the voice of somebody stating a thing they had accepted a long time ago and had built their entire life on top of. It doesn't stop. Not in this country, not in this school, not between you and me. Somebody's always going to swing first. His hand rested flat on the concrete beside Bakugo's head, so the only question left is what your power is for. Bakugo's teeth were locked. His eyes were enormous. Power is meant to end the fighting. Every time. Izuku leaned in a fraction. Power is the reason the fighting stops. That's it. That's the whole job. You could end so many fights, Katsuki. You could walk into a burning street and it would just be over because you were standing there. His voice did something then. It got softer, and somehow that was worse. Instead, you use it to start one with me in a hallway, and I've watched you do it for 6 years, and every single time it makes me sad. He stood up. He offered a hand down. Bakugo did not take it. He lay on the floor of a broken corridor and stared at the ceiling with his jaw shaking, and something behind his ribs came apart and reassembled wrong, and he would spend the next year finding out what it had become. "Bento's in my bag," Izuku said. "It's got the peppers you like." He walked off down the hall, and Bakugo lay there, and then he pressed both hands over his face and made a sound that never made it onto the recording because Aizawa killed the feed. In the observation room, 20 students had gone silent in a way that felt religious. Aizawa took out a notepad. He wrote one line on it. He looked at it for 8 seconds, closed the pad, and put it in his pocket. And when Yaoyorozu asked him later what it said, he told her it was a grocery list. It said, "He isn't a student. He's a landmark. Teach around him." And at the back of the room, standing where she had been watching the whole feed with her hands folded, Abara Shiozaki pressed her fingers over her mouth. Everyone else was reacting to the takedown. She had heard the sentence, "Power is the reason the fighting stops." She had grown up in a house full of scripture, and she had never once heard anybody say the thing she believed out loud, in a hallway, to a boy who had just tried to burn him alive. "Shiozaki?" Ashido said. "You okay?" "Yes," Ibara said, and her voice came out strange, and one of her vines had wrapped itself around her own wrist. "Yes, yes." They started meditating together on the second Thursday. She found him first, on the slope behind the training grounds, sitting cross-legged in the grass with his eyes shut and the grass bowed away from him in a wide ring and the wind going the wrong way around him. She should have left. She sat down instead, 3 meters off, and closed her eyes. Neither of them said anything for 40 minutes. When she opened her eyes, there was a plum tree over her that had not been there, and it was flowering out of season, and he was grinning at her like a man who had gotten away with something. "Your breathing changed," he said, around minute 20. "You went all the way down. Almost nobody does that. You could feel my breathing. I could feel the ground under your breathing." He said it like it was ordinary. "You go still and everything around you goes still with you. It's like, you know when a room gets peaceful because one person walked in? That's a real thing. That's chakra. You've got it and you don't even know." Ibara thought about that for a long moment. "My grandmother used to say something like that," she said, in different words. "Grandmothers are usually right about chakra." She laughed. It surprised her. An actual laugh, out loud, on a hillside. It became a habit, and then it became the shape of their weeks. Mornings before class, evenings after training. He talked to her about the way water and earth wanted to become the same thing if you asked them at the same time, and she talked to him about intercession and mercy and the doctrine of a soul that stands between harm and the innocent, and neither of them ever once told the other they were being strange. "You're the most genuinely peaceful person I've ever met," he told her one evening, apropos of nothing, while he grew a bench for them out of the hill. Ibara looked at the bench, then at him. "You say things like that with your whole chest," she said. "I mean them with my whole chest." "I know." She sat down on the bench and folded her hands. "That's the problem." He laughed so hard he fell into the grass. The bus to the unforeseen simulation joint left at 9. The warp gates opened at 9:41, and the plaza filled with 62 villains, and a hand-covered man in a hoodie stepped out of the black and said, "So he's not here. Fine. We'll kill some kids and see if that gets his attention." What happened next was in the record as Incident USJ, and the record ran to 200 pages, and every version of it disagreed except on the timeline. At 9:41, the students were on the staircase. At 9:42, 13 was down, and Aizawa was in the plaza, and he was magnificent. He took 11 of them off their feet in under a minute, hair up, elbows working, and everyone who watched that tape agreed he was the best fighter in the building for about 90 seconds. At 9:44, the Nomu caught him. It came out of the mist like a wall, and took him by the arm and broke it in 3 places in one motion, and then took the other one, and drove him face first into the pavement and held him there with a hand the size of a manhole cover. Blood ran into the tile grout. Shigaraki crouched down beside him and put a finger on his elbow and started decaying it for fun. "Where is he?" Shigaraki said. "All Might. Where?" Aizawa's one visible eye was still open. He was looking past Shigaraki, up at the staircase, and Shigaraki turned to see what an unconscious man's teacher instinct was tracking. The mist had gone still. 62 villains and every student in the building felt it at the same moment, a pressure coming down through the air, thick and vast and old, the way the sky feels before hail. Water in the flood zone flattened. Leaves in the mountain zone turned over. Somebody's quirk misfired. He had been gathering it since the gates opened. 20 seconds, standing on the stairs with his eyes closed while the class screamed around him, pulling natural energy out of 6 artificial biomes and the earth under them and holding it perfectly still under his skin. The marks came in around his eyes. 2 lines, a red-brown, running down from the lower lids, pulsing slow like something with a heartbeat. Sage mode. Izuku Midoriya opened his eyes and stepped off the top of the staircase. He fell 40 feet. He landed between the Nomu and Aizawa. The tile did not crack under him. The tile went in a perfect ring 6 meters across, a shockwave of pulverized concrete that knocked 4 villains flat and blew the mist out of the plaza entirely. The Nomu's fist was already coming down. He caught it with one hand and held it. He did not look at it. He was looking back over his shoulder. Up on the stairs, 19 students. Uraraka holding a Shido up. Sero with his arm bleeding. Yaoyorozu with a shield she had made too small. Bakugo halfway down the steps with both hands out and no target. And in the middle of them, Ibara Shiozaki, vines out, 4 meters of them, wrapped around 3 injured students and braced against the railing like a wall, hair loose and wild, her eyes locked on his and holding. Something in Izuku's face settled. He looked back at the Nomu and at the man with the hands, and at 60 villains in a plaza with a school class up a flight of stairs, and his voice came up out of him like water out of a broken main. These children are the village's treasure. It hit the floor. It hit the walls. It went through the dome and out of it. And people at the front gate of UA heard it. It was too much voice for a 15-year-old to have, and every single person in the USJ that day would say the same thing when asked, that for 1 second, they had the very clear sense that the thing shouting was much, much older than the boy standing there. Shigaraki took a step back. He had never ever done that in his life. Izuku threw the Nomu's fist away and clasped his hands. Sage art. Gracious deity gates. The ceiling of the USJ came apart, not a hole. A section, 60 meters of reinforced dome, blown outward from the inside as 10 torii gates punched through it going down. They were red. They were solid wood. Each one weighed as much as a rail bridge, and they came out of the sky in a line, and the plaza filled with a sound that people in Musutafu called in as an explosion. Thud. The first one landed across the Nomu's neck and put its face through the tile. Thud. The second across the spine. Something in the Nomu's back gave with a wet crunch that had absolutely no shock absorption in it at all. Thud. both arms pinned at the elbow, the wood driving 4 meters into the plaza foundation on either side. Thud! Both legs. Then 4 more crossed over the first 6, hammering down in a pattern that locked the whole thing into an X of divine weight, and the last one came down so hard that the water in the flood zone jumped its bank. Silence. Dust going up in a column. The Nomu was under 900 tons of wood in a cross formation, and every one of those gates was radiating natural energy directly into its body, and its quirk factor simply stopped. Shock absorption, gone. Regeneration, flatlined. A nervous system full of borrowed healing, suddenly with nothing to draw on and nowhere to put it. It heaved once. Its exposed brain matter pulsed, and then did not. It made a sound out of its beak that was not a roar and was not a threat, and was not anything at all except the noise a living thing makes when it discovers that it cannot move and never will again. 4.5 seconds. He had not thrown a punch. Shigaraki Tomura stood in the plaza with a dead teacher's blood on his fingers and looked at his masterpiece. He had built that. Not personally, but he had been promised that. It was the anti-symbol. It was 5 years and an unspeakable amount of money, and the last word on the subject of all might. He had watched it take a hit from a professional and shrug. He had planned this whole day around what it could do. A first-year student had pinned it to the ground like a butterfly in a case, and then turned his back on it. Because that was the part. Izuku had already turned around. He was kneeling beside Aizawa, with both palms flat on his back, and green light was going into the teacher's ruined arms, and he was saying, "You did so well, sensei. Hold on, I've got you," in a voice thick with tears. "What?" Shigaraki said, Tomura. Kurogiri's voice came from behind him, and it was fast, and it was tight. "Tomura, we are leaving." "What is that?" "We are leaving." The mist was already forming. Kurogiri had been alive for a long time and had a very good instinct for the moment a plan stops being a plan. Plan. Yeah. Every gate in this building is saturated. I cannot warp inside their radius. He has 11 more in the ceiling, and he has not looked at us once, and I would prefer that continue. Around the plaza, the League was doing arithmetic without help. Villains with knives were putting the knives away. 2 of them were sitting down. One man in a mask had wet himself and was quite reasonably making no comment. The lizard-headed one they called Spinner was staring up at the torii gates with his mouth open, saying, That's a shrine." He built a shrine on it. Shigaraki's hand went to his own throat and scratched until it bled. "Fine," he said. Fine. Note his face. The gate swallowed them at 9:49. All Might arrived at 9:51. He came through the entrance hall at the top of his speed in his prime, with the doors coming off their hinges behind him, ready to be the answer. And he stopped dead on the landing. The plaza below him was still. 60 villains were unconscious, tied up in root systems, or sitting cooperatively with their hands on their heads. There were 10 red torii gates rising out of the tile in a cross, 60 meters tall, sunlight coming down through the hole in his school's roof and lighting the whole thing up like a temple courtyard. There was a creature the size of a bus pinned motionless beneath them. There were 19 children coming down the stairs. And there was a boy in the middle of the plaza with marks under his eyes, on his knees, crying, holding Shota Aizawa's head off the ground with both hands and telling him over and over that he was going to be okay. Toshinori Yagi had been the strongest man in the world for 20 years. He had walked into a great many rooms and been the thing that made them safe. He stood on the landing with his hands loose at his sides and his mouth slightly open, and he wore an expression that nobody had ever photographed on him, and nobody would again. And the closest anybody came to naming it later was a man arriving at his own party a day late. "Young Midoriya," he said. Izuku looked up. His face was a wreck. He sniffed hugely. "He's alive," he said, and then, absolutely wailing, "He's alive, sensei, but his arms are so broken. They're so broken." "Yes," said All Might faintly. "Yes, I can see that. I'll call Recovery Girl." The dust took a long time to come down through the hole in the roof. It came slow in the light, and it made everything look like the inside of a lantern. Ibarra found him sitting on the edge of the plaza fountain, boots in the drain basin, watching the paramedics load Aizawa. The marks had faded from around his eyes. He looked about 9 years old. She sat down next to him. Her vines were shaking, and she made no attempt to hide it. For a while, neither of them spoke, which was normal for them. Then she reached over and put her hand on his forearm. Once. Briefly. 3 seconds, no more. Her fingers flat against a bare arm that had had the skin burned off it 2 weeks ago and had grown it back. When you shouted, she said, and her voice was very low, and she kept her eyes forward. I stopped being afraid. Everyone did. Everyone on those stairs, all at once. Her thumb moved slightly. I have been in prayer my whole life, and I have never felt anything come down on a room like that. He turned his head. You called us your treasure, she said. Izuku Midoriya, who cried at three-legged dogs and at good lunches and at a documentary about tide pools, did not cry. He looked at her with an expression that had nothing loud in it anywhere, and he sat perfectly still under her hand like a man who did not want to spook a bird. Yeah, he said. Ibara took her hand back. Her ears were a color. You have blood on your face, she said, standing. It's not mine, he said, and then brightly, oh, it's the frog one's, Asui. She got a nosebleed and I hugged her. Please stop hugging people during disasters. Never. The sports festival got 71 million viewers. The obstacle course got 71 million viewers. What happened after that got renegotiated broadcast rights. Izuku's start was unremarkable in the sense that he came out of the tunnel in 5th place, laughing because Kaminari had said something funny. Then the robot gate hit and he walked up to a 0-pointer, and rather than fight it, he grew a ramp under himself and jogged up it and over the machine's head while apologizing to it. He apologized to the robot. Present Mike said, Listeners, I want that on the record. He said sorry to the robot. The chasm section had chains over a drop. Izuku grew a bridge, not a plank. A bridge, wide enough for 4 people with a railing and, the footage is very clear on this, decorative posts. He strolled across it. Actually strolled. Uraraka came past him at a dead sprint and he called, Nice pace, Uraraka, and she screamed, Thank you, without slowing down. Tokoyami used the bridge. Yaoyorozu used the bridge. By the time the main body of the field arrived, there were 19 kids running across a hand-grown timber bridge over a 100-meter drop, and Izuku was in the middle of it chatting with Kirishima about whether hardening hurt. It doesn't hurt, man. It's like flexing. Flexing. Like flexing. Kirishima, that's so beautiful. Bro, are you crying? We're in a race. The minefield was the moment the broadcast lost all professional composure. The field was 300 meters of buried explosives. Every other competitor was picking their way through it at a crawl or blowing themselves forward on purpose. Izuku Midoriya put his hands together, and a second bridge came up out of the minefield. A long, gentle, arcing wooden viaduct, 12 meters up, running the entire length of the field, with lanterns. He had grown lanterns, wooden ones. Nobody has ever been able to explain the lanterns. He walked it, hands behind his back, enjoying the view. That's illegal, Present Mike shrieked. That's midnight. Is that legal? Midnight was laughing so hard she had to hold the desk. There's nothing in the rules about he's building, Mike. He's not attacking anyone. She wiped her eyes. It's unprecedented. Write that down. Unprecedented. He has lanterns. He has lanterns. Mike. He crossed the finish line first by 90 seconds, having exerted himself approximately as much as a man walking to a mailbox. And then he turned around and cheered for every single person who came in behind him by name for 4 straight minutes, with his hands cupped around his mouth. He cried when Mineta finished. He cried harder when a general studies girl with a nosebleed finished. The stadium did not know whether boo, cheer, or take him home and feed him, and settled on all 3 at different volumes. The crowd never fully recovered. There was a section behind third base that started chanting for the trees. The tournament bracket delivered what everyone wanted by the semifinal, and it delivered it in the form of a boy with white hair on one side and red on the other, standing across 60 meters of concrete with frost already forming on his shoulder. Shoto Todoroki had gone through the entire festival on his right side. He had not thrown 1 degree of heat. He had won 3 matches with walls of ice and a face like a closed door, and the whole country had been watching him do it and calling it dominance. Izuku had watched him do it and called it something else. You're going to freeze the arena, Izuku said, rolling his neck. Yes. All of it? Yes. Okay. Izuku brightened. Do that. I want to see. Midnight said begin, and Shoto Todoroki froze the arena. It was the single largest output of his life to that point. The ice came off his foot in a wave, and it did not stop at Izuku. It went around him, up the walls, over the boundary line, 20 meters high, in a curving bowl, and the temperature in the stadium dropped 11 degrees in 4 seconds. The front rows got frost on their hair. The commentary booth window fogged solid. Inside the ice, buried to the chest, Izuku Midoriya said, "Oh, that's gorgeous." Then he said, "Wood style, wood dragon jutsu." The ice came apart from underneath. The dragon came up through it, a serpentine mass of woven timber, the length of the whole field, head like a temple guardian, jaw hinged and open, and its body kept unspooling out of the ground, coil after coil, up the walls of Todoroki's ice fortress and through it. It went into the fortress the way rot goes into a house. Every place it touched, it held, and every place it held, it began to draw. Todoroki felt it immediately, and he had no idea what he was feeling. His output was fine, his arm was fine, and his ice was slowing down anyway. The wall he was maintaining was going soft at the roots, and the cold he was pouring out was going somewhere, into the wood, into the ground, out of the world. He compensated, he pushed harder. The air went to 15 below, and half the stadium put on their jackets. He was fighting a construct that ate what he made, and got heavier doing it. Shoto. The dragon's head lifted, and standing on its snout, 1 foot forward, arms loose, was a boy with green hair and a red armored chest. Shoto! Todoroki's hand came up. You're freezing your own heart. The stadium went silent. 71 million people got very still. You're standing in the middle of the biggest wall you've ever built, and you are shivering, and you'd rather shiver than use half of what you are. Izuku's voice had nothing calculated in it. There was no strategy in it, no baiting. It was a boy shouting across an arena because he genuinely could not stand what he was looking at. I can feel your chakra. It's split. There's a whole half of you in there with the door nailed shut, and you're calling that strength. You don't know anything about... A true shinobi embraces everything they are. It came out of him like the USJ. It came off the walls. All of it. Every ugly piece. Every part somebody gave you that you didn't ask for. You take it and you carry it and you use it to protect the people you love. That's the whole job. You don't get to throw half of yourself away and call it winning. Shoto Todoroki's right hand was still up. His left was shaking at his side. Somewhere in the front row of the stands, a man in a coat with white hair and a burned scar leaned forward and said, out loud, "What is he doing?" Somewhere else, Class 1A's section, second tier, Ibara Shiozaki had both hands over her heart, and in the middle of a frozen arena, a boy who had spent 10 years refusing his own left side made a sound like something tearing. "Shut up," said Shoto Todoroki, and he burned. The fire came out of him from the shoulder to the fingertips, and it did not come out neat. It came out enormous. A column of flame that went 30 meters up and blew the entire ice fortress into steam in one breath. A white detonation that hid the field, and inside it he was screaming, and it was not a battle cry. It was the sound of a boy who had held something down since he was 5 years old and had finally lost his grip on it. The stadium came up out of its seats as one animal. Steam rolled over the boundary walls. The temperature spiked 40 degrees. Midnight had an arm up over her face. Present Mike was making a noise into a live microphone that engineers still have on file. And in the middle of it, in the wall of white, someone was laughing. Izuku Midoriya came out of the steam grinning so wide it looked like it hurt him. The biggest, dumbest, most delighted grin of his entire life, tears streaming down both cheeks, arms already up. That's it! He met the fire. The wood dragon coiled around it and drank it, and the thermal load went down through the dragon into the earth. And Izuku routed it. He took the heat of a boy's entire suppressed childhood, dropped up both palms toward the ground, and pushed it into the arena floor. Every square meter of concrete in the stadium bloomed. Cherry trees came up through the field, hundreds of them, thousands, and they came up already flowering, and the heat opened every blossom at once. Pink and white went up in a wave from the center out. Blossoms filled the air until you could barely see the competitors. Petals went over the boundary walls, into the stands, into people's hair, into the commentary booth, into a hot dog vendor's tray. The whole bowl of the stadium filled with the smell of spring in the middle of a fight. 71 million people watched a war become an orchard. Todoroki came through the petals with his left arm still burning and everything in his face wide open, and he threw everything he had left in one punch. Izuku met him with an open wooden palm at full extension, bark running up his arm from the elbow, the hand 3 times the size it should have been, and he caught the punch, absorbed it, and pushed. He pushed firmly. He pushed cleanly. He did not put 1 gram more into it than the job required, and there was nothing in it that wanted to hurt anybody. Shoto Todoroki went backward through a snowfall of pink and out over the boundary line and landed on his back in the grass beyond it, staring up at a canopy that had not existed 90 seconds ago. "Shoto Todoroki is out of bounds," said Midnight, in the voice of somebody reading a card because it was in her hand. Izuku Midoriya advances. Nobody heard her. Nobody in that stadium was talking about the result. 40,000 people were standing in a forest that had grown through the concrete of a national sports arena, catching cherry blossoms out of the air with their hands in silence, and then all at once with a sound that registered on a seismograph in Chiba. Izuku ran over and pulled Todoroki up by the wrist. "The left one. Your fire is so warm," he said, weeping openly. "Shoto, it made flowers. Do you understand what you just did? You made spring." Todoroki looked at his own left hand, then at the trees, then at a crying boy in red armor. "I need to talk to my mother," he said. "Yes, you do." Izuku hugged him. Todoroki did not know what to do with his arms and left them where they were. Up in the stands, Ibara Shiozaki had a petal caught in her vines and had made no move to remove it. Her eyes were shining and she was not blinking. "He didn't beat him," she said, mostly to herself. "He unlocked him." Yaoyorozu beside her was still standing up. "Shiozaki, the floor is a forest." "Yes." "He grew a forest through the drainage system of a stadium as a side effect of a punch." "Yes." Ibara touched the petal in her hair, and something in her voice went somewhere private. "Momo, there is a soul like that in the world, and it sits behind me in class, and it tells me my hair is beautiful, and I do not know what to do about it." Momo Yaoyorozu turned her head very slowly. "Oh," she said. The judge's deliberation lasted 11 minutes and abandoned any pretense of objective assessment inside the first 2. There was a scoring rubric. Nobody opened it. Vlad King said, "How do we grade that?" And Nezu said, "We don't, we frame it." And Recovery Girl said, "I've got 40 kids with petals in their lungs, and I've never been happier about anything." And All Might sat at the end of the table saying nothing at all with his hands folded and his eyes wet. Internships put Izuku and Ibara in Hosu City under Kamui Woods, who had spent 4 days having what could reasonably be called a crisis and had come out the other side of it as the single most enthusiastic mentor in the profession. "You understand," he had said on day 1, "that my quirk is lumber." "It's beautiful," Izuku said. "It's lumber, kid, and you tore a bank vault open with a root last night. Your control is so much better than mine. You do that thing where the branches lock at the joint. I'd have to think about that. You just do it." Kamui Woods had gone home that night and sat in the dark for a while and then called his mother. The night it happened was warm and slow. They walked a patrol route through the eastern wards, and Ibara talked about a passage she had read that morning. Something in the Book of Wisdom about the righteous standing between the sword and the child. And Izuku listened with his whole face turned toward her, actually asking questions, the way almost nobody does. Say that part again. The part about standing between? Yeah, that part. He was walking backward now to keep looking at her. Say it again, I want to remember it. He walked into a lamppost. He apologized to the lamppost. Then the screaming started 3 streets over, and both of them ran. The alley was narrow and wet, and the smell reached them before the sight did. Native was down at the far end, face first, blood pooling from a shoulder wound. Tenya Ida was on his knees against the brick, armor cracked, one gauntlet mangled, and he was completely paralyzed. Every muscle locked, eyes rolling, the tendons in his neck standing out with the effort of a body screaming at itself to move and getting nothing back. There were tears cutting through the blood on his face. His mouth was open around a word he could not make. Above him stood a man wrapped in rags and stitched leather, with knives in his belt and a katana held loose in one hand, and a face like a hatchet. Stain turned around. He looked at Ibara for half a second and dismissed her. Then he looked at Izuku, and something in his posture changed. His weight shifted, his grip closed, and his eyes went narrow with the specific interest of a man who has killed 31 people and can tell within a heartbeat which ones will actually be a fight. "Well," said the hero killer. He came off the wall. He was fast, genuinely, terrifyingly fast. A blur of rag and steel down 8 meters of wet brick. And the katana came up in a diagonal cut, aimed at the throat. Izuku caught the blade in his bare hand. There was a sound like a struck bell being dropped from a roof. The steel folded, buckled, and burst into pieces at the third of its length, and the fragments went past Izuku's ear and stuck in the brick behind him, and the alley was suddenly very still. Stain looked at the hilt in his hand. 9 centimeters of blade left on it. He looked up. Izuku had not moved. His palm was open. There was a line of gray dust on it where a katana used to be. Under his eyes, the 2 red-brown marks pulsed once. "You," Stain said, and his voice was low and it was almost warm. "You have the eyes of a true warrior. I've been looking for those eyes for 9 years." He dropped the hilt. It rang on the concrete. "The conviction in you is real. It's clean. There's nothing borrowed in it." His head tilted toward Ida on the ground. "And yet you stand with fakes. You bleed for a system of cowards playing at heroism for money and cameras. Why?" Izuku looked down at Tenya Ida. He looked at a 17-year-old boy locked inside his own body, crying in an alley over a brother in a hospital bed, so full of grief and rage that his throat was working around nothing. He looked back at Stain. "I will deal with you later." It came out flat. There was nothing in it. No fury, no argument, no interest in the conversation whatsoever. It was the tone of a man who had finished a piece of work and was now noting where the file needed to go, and it landed on Stain harder than any threat in his life ever had. Izuku kicked the ground. The alley came alive. Roots came out of both brick walls at once. Out of the mortar, out of the drain pipes, out of the ground under the standing water, thick and fast and everywhere, and they did not grope for him. They arrived like they had always been in there, waiting for a signal. They took his wrists first, then the arms above and below the elbow, then a coil around the torso that lifted him off his feet and put him against the wall, and then more and more, tightening in layers. Every knife on his body went at once. There were 19 of them. They crushed inside their sheaths, and the sheaths crushed too, and the sound of it was a long series of small breakages that went on for 4 full seconds. The remains of the katana went to splinters and dust. His left gauntlet folded around his forearm. A vial in his coat burst, and the blood in it ran down the roots and did nothing at all. Stain was pinned to a brick wall 4 meters up, arms out, torso wrapped, held so completely that the only things he could do were breathe and watch. He could breathe and watch. And Izuku Midoriya had already turned his back on him. He crossed the alley in 3 steps and went down on one knee beside Ida, and his hand came down flat on the boy's shoulder. Green light went into him. It went in slow, not a burst, a flood at low pressure, natural energy, pushing up under the paralysis and warming the blood back into motion. Ida's locked jaw shifted a millimeter. A finger twitched. "Hey," Izuku said. "Hey, Tenya, hey, breathe out for me." Ida made a sound. "I know." Izuku's other hand came up to the side of his head, steadying him. "I know about your brother. I read the report the night it happened and I threw up." His voice was very low, meant to go about 1/2 meter and no further. "I know exactly what's in you right now. You wanted to be the one. You wanted to look at the man who did it and have it mean something, and instead you're on the floor and I'm here, and that's the worst thing in the world." Ida's eyes came around to him. They were streaming. "It's okay that you wanted it," Izuku said. "It's okay that you came here angry. Anger is just love with the door kicked in." He tightened his grip. "But your brother is alive, Tenya. He's alive, and he's in a bed in Hosu General, and he is going to want to know how you are. So we're going to get you moving, and then we're going to go and see him, and you can be furious the whole way there. I'll carry you if I have to. I'll carry you both." Ida's hand closed on Izuku's forearm. He got it closed. Fingers, palm, grip. It took 40 seconds, and it was the hardest thing he had ever physically done. And when it happened, he broke apart completely, sobbing in an alley, holding onto a classmate's arm with the one part of his body that would obey him. He managed. Think. Yeah, Izuku said. I know. Me too. Ibara had gone to native, packed the shoulder wound with vines to slow the bleed, and called it in. Now she came and knelt on Izuku's other side, and without any hesitation at all, she took his hand. The whole hand, fingers threaded, in front of the paralyzed hero student and the unconscious hero and the most wanted murderer in the country. Your soul, she said, is beautiful. She said it in a specific voice. He had heard her use it exactly twice before, both times about scripture. Izuku Midoriya, who had that afternoon apologized to a lamppost, looked at their hands and went absolutely scarlet from the collar up and said nothing whatsoever for 11 seconds. Okay, he said. Okay. 4 meters up on the wall, Akaguro Chizome watched all of it. He had built an entire life on a single idea, and the idea was a knife, and the knife had one edge. False heroes seek glory, true heroes seek nothing. He had tested every man he ever killed against it, and it had always worked. He had killed 31 people and been right 31 times, and that record was the closest thing to a soul he had left. Down in the water and the blood, a 15-year-old boy who had disarmed him in less than a second, who had never once looked at him with hatred, who had never bothered to be afraid, who had not stayed to receive a single word of acknowledgement, was on his knees in the filth of an alley, pouring his own life force into a paralyzed classmate's spine and crying about the boy's brother and holding a girl's hand. There was no glory in it. There was no camera. There was nothing sought and nothing taken. He was the thing Stain had spent 9 years insisting could not exist. And he had ended him with a kick, and he had not even watched it happen. Stain hung in the roots and, for the first time in his adult life, could find nothing to say about a man. The Hosu police arrived at 11:24. Kamui Woods arrived at 11:26 and had to sit down on a step. There is a photograph from that night. It ran on the front of every paper in the country of the hero killer immobilized 4 meters up a brick wall, while in the foreground and out of focus, 2 students in dirty costumes kneel over a third one and hold a hand each. The caption in the Yomiuri was 2 words long. He was busy. The Shi Hasaikai raid was supposed to be the hardest day of the year, and the plan was 40 pages long, and it survived 9 minutes. The maze was Overhaul's masterpiece. Corridors that folded shut behind you and opened somewhere else, walls that grew back in 3 seconds, staircases that ended in stone, rooms that were the same room. Night Eye had wargamed it, Ryukyu had drilled her team on it, and none of that mattered because the labyrinth was designed for a single purpose, to spend your time. And time was the one resource that mattered because a 6-year-old girl was being carried further underground every minute. They were running. All of them. Fat Gum's team, Night Eye's, Ryukyu's, 20-plus pros and 4 students in a shifting concrete stomach, splitting up, doubling back, screaming coordinates at each other while the walls closed. 12 minutes in, Sir Night Eye's foresight told him they were going to be 40 seconds late, and he did not tell anyone. At minute 14, Izuku Midoriya stopped running. Midoriya! Fat Gum's shout came from around a corner that had been a wall a moment ago. Kid, move. This corridor's about to. Izuku knelt down in the middle of it and put both hands flat on the floor. The ground had been talking to him since he walked in. Under the concrete and the rebar and the poured foundation, there was clay, and under the clay, there was water, and it had been pressing on the inside of his palms for 14 minutes while a little girl was carried away from the sun. He had been gathering the whole time. Sage energy came up his arms in 2 lines, and the marks came in around his eyes, and the temperature in the corridor rose a degree. The floor started to hum. Dust jumped off the walls in a fine haze. Somewhere behind him, a light fixture came out of its housing. He raised his head and looked up the tunnel, past 3 walls, in the direction his hands told him she was, and his voice came out of him and filled every corridor in the labyrinth at once. No matter what happens, I will protect our world. Wood style. Deep Forest Emergence. What happened next generated a seismic event that registered in 3 prefectures, and the official report used the phrase catastrophic vertical displacement, which is a bureaucrat's way of saying that the ground stopped being in charge. The trunks came up. They came up everywhere, all at once, through the whole footprint of the compound. Trees 80 meters tall, some of them wider than the corridors they grew through, and they did not break the walls so much as declare the walls irrelevant. Concrete became gravel, became dust. Rebar snapped in ripples. The shifting maze, the masterpiece, the whole living architecture of a criminal empire came apart from the inside in less than 5 seconds because something enormous decided to stand up inside it. And then the roots lifted. The entire Shihasaikai compound came out of the earth. 12,000 square meters of subterranean base rose on a bed of root systems the size of highway overpasses. It went up 11 meters and kept going, corridors splitting open along their seams, ceilings sloughing off in slabs, whole rooms breaking free and tipping sideways, and light came in. Sunlight poured down into hallways that had been sealed for 9 years. Every hiding place, every panic room, every escape shaft, every locked laboratory with a steel door and a keypad opened to the sky like a shoebox turned over. Above ground, the police cordon watched a hill they had been standing on for 2 hours become a mountain, and then become a forest, and then become a broken maze, sitting in the branches of it, held 11 meters up in the air by roots, with heroes and villains alike stumbling out onto exposed floors and staring around in the daylight. Sir Night Eye stood on a slab of what had been a corridor, with wind in his hair, and looked at a future that had rearranged itself so completely that his own quirk gave him a headache. "Ah," he said. 20 meters away, on a broken floor with the roof gone, Kai Chisaki looked up at the sky he had spent a decade avoiding. Something in him broke that had been holding since he was 14. "You," he said. You ruined?" He put his hands on his own men. The fusion took 8 seconds, and it was obscene. Flesh came off 3 bodies and went into his, and stone came out of the rubble and went in after it. And what stood up at the end of it was 6 meters tall and had 9 arms and a face like a smeared photograph. Its chest was armor. Its arms were spears. It could rebuild any part of itself in less than a second, and it had already done the math. And the math said that nothing on the planet could break it faster than it could put itself back together. It screamed. Every window left in the district went. Izuku walked out onto the open floor. The marks were burning under his eyes. He rolled his shoulders. Somewhere behind him, Eri was crying, and he could hear it exactly. "Wood style, wood human," he said. "Come up." The avatar rose out of the exposed earth below the compound. It came up through the root bed, and it kept coming. A wooden giant, 40 meters, then 60, shoulders like a mountain ridge, a broad ancient face with heavy brows and a mouth set flat, built out of the same root system that had torn a criminal empire out of the ground. Its arms came free of the soil with tons of dirt sliding off them. Its hand closed on a slab of concrete the size of a tennis court and set it aside like a man moving a book. Izuku stood on its shoulder. Chisaki attacked. He had to. He fired first. Stone spikes, 9 of them, launched from 9 arms, each one accelerating through reconstructed matter, each one capable of going through a bank wall. They hit the avatar's open palms and burst. Every single one. They drove in 3 centimeters and stopped and came apart, and the palms closed, and there was nothing left in them but grit. The second barrage came, doubled, and the avatar caught it with both hands, one and then the other, and closed its fingers and ground the whole volley into powder between them. And the sound of it rolled out over Nagoya like a building being demolished. Then it punched him. One punch. The full weight of a 60-meter wooden god, shoulder-driven, straight down the line into the center of that armored chest. The impact separated the fusion. Stone armor came off in sheets and went out sideways in a cone. Fused flesh split along the joins it never should have had, and 3 men came apart from one and were flung clear, alive and unconscious, into rubble that had been underground 11 minutes ago. The quirk factor at the center of it ruptured. The whole reconstructive architecture blew out and stopped answering. The shockwave crossed the compound, folded a truck in the parking lot, and knocked the news helicopter's audio out for 6 seconds, Kaichisaki hit the ground 200 meters away and skidded through the wreckage of his own kingdom and came to a stop on his back. He was a man in a torn coat. That was all he was. Both arms lay at wrong angles beside him. He was staring straight up into a canopy of leaves where his ceiling had been for 9 years, and the sunlight coming through them was moving in patches on his face, and there was nothing left of the thing he had been building. Not the maze, not the lab, not the bullets, or the plan, or the promise he had made to a dead man's memory about a world that would kneel. There was a forest growing through it. He was still alive when they cuffed him. He never said another word about his ambitions to anyone, ever again. Izuku came down the Avatar's arm and dropped the last few meters into the rubble. Ahead of him, in a gap between two broken slabs, a very small girl in a hospital gown was sitting in the dust with her arms over her head, and she was crying so hard she had stopped making sound. He crossed to her at a walk. He knelt, he took off his green coat and put it around her, all the way around, tucked at the collar, sleeves pushed up out of the way, and he lifted her with both arms, one under her legs and one around her back, and he stood up with her the way you stand up with something you have decided you are never going to drop. She was shaking. Her whole body was shaking, and her hands came up and grabbed a fistful of his shirt. "Hey," he said. "Look up." She did not. "Eri." His voice was very low, and it had the exact same weight it had when he told people true things about their souls. "Look up, just once. There's sky." She looked up. Sunlight came down through 80 meters of new leaves and moved on her face, and she flinched from it, and then she did not. "That's yours," Izuku said. "The sun's yours. It's been up there the entire time and nobody told you." His arms tightened. "Nobody is ever going to put a roof between you and that again. And do you understand me? Not one person. I'll pull the roof up. I'll do it every single time. That's what I'm for." Eri looked at the leaves. Then she looked at the crying boy holding her because he was crying, absolutely wrecked. Tears cutting tracks through the concrete dust on his face while he held a 6-year-old like a bomb made of glass. She pressed her face into his collar and howled. He held her and let her, and he did not shush her once. Ibarra reached them 9 seconds later, vines dragging in the dust, and she came up short at the sight and put both hands over her mouth. She had things she intended to say. She looked at the girl in the green coat and the boy holding her, and decided that they would wait until there were fewer people in the world. She stepped in and put a hand on Eri's back, and one on his arm, and stood with them. The heroes came out of the rubble and stood on broken floors and looked at what they were standing in. The Shi Hasaikai compound sat 11 meters above the original grade, cradled in a root system that the city of Nagoya would eventually declare a protected structure, because removing it was, on inspection, impossible. A forest of 80-meter trees had come up through the entire block. Ambulance crews had to be lifted in. 2 police officers refused to walk under the branches and were reassigned. Ryukyu, in dragon form, hovered at eye level with a wooden giant and had absolutely nothing to say into her radio. Fat Gum sat down on a slab and put his head in his hands and laughed for a while, in the way people do after certain kinds of days. The Hero Public Safety Commission's incident report was filed 11 days later. It ran to 406 pages. The relevant paragraph on page 9 read as follows. At 1419, provisional license holder Izuku Midoriya, 15, initiated a single technique which resulted in the total vertical extraction of the target compound from a depth of 34 meters, terminating the operation's search phase and rendering all internal defensive architecture inoperable. Estimated displaced mass, 480,000 metric tons. Estimated duration, 5 seconds. Casualties among hostages, 0. Casualties among heroes, 0. The Commission notes that no existing framework, legal, tactical, or operational, accounts for the deployment of this individual and recommends the immediate formation of a working group to consider the matter. The Commission further notes that Midoriya remained on site for 3 hours after the incident to reinforce the root structure so that it wouldn't fall on anybody later, and that he apologized to the Nagoya Municipal Engineering Office in person. Shoda Aizawa read the report at his desk with his arms still in their braces. He got to page 9. He read the paragraph. He He read it again. He put it down on the desk, squared the edges, and did not pick it up again for 3 days. She came and found him that night on the roof of the temporary lodging, because of course she did. He had grown a tree up through the corner of the roof at some point in the evening, without asking anyone, and he was sitting in the crook of it with his boots hanging, watching the lights of a city that had a new forest in it. His hands were filthy. He had eaten 4 dinners. Eri was asleep 2 floors down with a wooden nightlight he had grown that had leaves on it. Abara climbed up beside him, which took some doing in a hero costume, and sat down on the branch. For a while, neither of them said anything, which was the language they were fluent in. "They're going to make a law about you," she said eventually. "Probably. There's a man on television right now arguing that you should be classified as infrastructure." "That's rude," Izuku said, "but also fair." She laughed. He grinned at the sound of it. Below them, a car went past, then Abara Shiozaki, who had spent 9 hours deciding, turned on the branch to face him. "I had something I wanted to say to you," she said. "I decided it in the rubble." He went still. "When you lifted that building," she said, "I was standing 40 meters away and the ground went out from under me, and I have never in my life been that frightened. Not of you." Her hands were folded in her lap, and her vines were very still. "Of what it means that the world has something like you in it, that the earth listens when you talk to it. I have prayed since I was 4 years old, and I have believed every word of it, and standing in that dust I understood, all at once, that I have been praying towards something, and you have been answering the phone." Izuku's mouth opened. "Let me finish." She did not look away from him. "And then you put your coat on that child, and you told her the sun was hers." Her voice went, just slightly, and she let it. "You could pull a criminal empire out of the ground with your hands, and the first thing you did afterward was find a little girl and get down on your knees so she wouldn't have to look up at you." She reached over and took his hand. The whole hand, filthy, calloused, still with bark grain faint across the knuckles, and held it in both of hers. "I love you," said Abara Shiozaki. "I have loved you since the corridor, when you looked sad instead of angry. I wanted to say it somewhere with fewer people." The city hummed underneath them. Izuku Midoriya, who cried at 3-legged dogs and good lunches, who apologized to robots, who had that afternoon displaced 480,000 tons of earth in 5 seconds, and then said sorry to the engineering office, sat in a tree he had grown on somebody else's roof and looked at their hands and did not make a single sound. Then he turned his face up to the sky and burst into tears so violently he nearly fell out of the tree. "Abara, oh no. Abara, your soul. Please get down from, you're going to fall." "I'm going to grow you a garden," he sobbed, gripping her hand with both of his. "I'm going to grow you the biggest garden anyone has ever, there's going to be a pond. Izuku." He stopped. He hiccuped. She reached up and put her palm against the side of his face, thumb under the faded mark where the sage lines had been 6 hours ago, and she held it there. "Yes," she said. "A pond would be nice." He laughed. It came out cracked and wet and enormous, the way everything about him came out, and it rolled off the roof and down the street, and somebody in a window across the way looked up to see where the sound was coming from, and saw a tree that had not been there in the morning. They sat like that for a long time. Below them, 300 meters away, 480,000 tons of concrete sat in the branches of a forest that had grown in 5 seconds and would still be standing there in 90 years with a shrine at the base of the largest trunk that nobody would ever take down. Above them, the sky was clear, and Izuku Midoriya in the branches with a girl's hand in his, and a small girl asleep 2 floors down, and a whole village of loud, ridiculous, terrified, devoted people scattered through the building beneath him, and felt the ground go still under all of it. The way it goes still when something enormous and immovable has decided to stand exactly where it is. Morning came into Nagoya slow and gray and smelling of sap. The city had been up all night in the way cities are when something enormous happens inside them. Sirens winding down, generators running, a news helicopter that had refused to leave and was now just circling out of habit, and 300 meters east of the temporary lodging, 480,000 tons of criminal architecture sitting 11 meters above the ground in the arms of a forest that had grown in 5 seconds and had every intention of staying. Eri Chisaki woke at 4:40 because the room had gotten brighter. She was 6 years old, and she had spent most of those years underground. And the thing she had learned about brightness was that it meant somebody had come in. So she went very still first, the way you do, with the blanket pulled up under her chin, and she listened for footsteps, and there weren't any. The light was coming from the nightlight. It sat on the low table by the window where he had put it, a hands-width knot of wood with a hollow center and a soft glow inside it, and when he had grown it out of his palm the night before, it had 3 leaves. Now it had 11. They had come out along the base and up one side, and 2 of them had unrolled sometime in the small hours, pale green and new, and the light coming through them laid leaf shapes on the wall. Eri got out of bed and sat on the windowsill with her knees up and watched them. She had questions. She had a great many questions, and she had learned that asking them was a thing that got you hurt. So she held them behind her teeth and looked at the leaves and looked out the window at the shape on the horizon where the forest was, and the sky went from gray to gray blue, and at 5:12 she heard the floorboard outside her door make a sound. The door opened about a hand's width. "Are you awake?" said Izuku Midoriya in the smallest voice a person that size has ever produced. "Because if you're asleep, I'm going to close this and be extremely embarrassed." "I'm awake." "Oh, good." He came in. He was wearing a t-shirt and a pair of training pants, and there was still concrete dust in his hair because he had gone to bed at 3 in the morning after reinforcing a root system for 3 hours, and he had a plate in one hand with 2 rice balls on it. He looked at her on the windowsill and then at the nightlight, and his whole face changed. It grew. It grew a lot. It grew a lot. He came over and crouched down and looked at it from about 10 centimeters away, hands on his knees, absolutely delighted. 11. That's okay. That's more than I expected. I gave it about half a breath of chakra, and it must have liked the window. Things do that. They find the light, and then they show off about it. He glanced up at her. "Do you want it to stop? I can ask it to stop." Eri thought about that with total seriousness. "No," she said. "Okay." He sat down on the floor with his back against the wall under the window so that his head was below hers, and he set the plate on the sill next to her feet, and he did not touch her and did not reach for her and did not ask her a single thing about what had happened yesterday or the day before that or any of the 900 days before that. He talked about the trees. "So the big ones out there," he said, tipping his head toward the window. "The tall ones on the left, the ones with the flat gray bark. Do you see the tallest one?" She looked. She nodded. "That one's about 900 years old." Her head came around. "It is," he said. "That's the thing nobody believes. It came up yesterday afternoon at about 2:15, and it's 900 years old, because when I grow something, I don't make a baby tree and then hurry it up. I ask the ground what's already down there. Okay, this is going to sound strange." He pulled a knee up and wrapped an arm around it. Under the concrete, under the pipes, way down under all of it, there's water and there's earth, and they've been sitting next to each other for a very long time, wanting to be the same thing. And there's life in there. Old life. Roots that rotted and went back into the dirt, seeds that never got their chance, leaves from 1,000 years of autumn all pressed down flat. It's all still in there. Nothing ever actually leaves. Eri stared at him. "So when I put my hands down and ask," Izuku said, "the ground doesn't make me something new. It gives me back what it's been holding. That tree isn't a young tree that got big fast. It's an old tree that finally got let out." He smiled at the window. "That's why the wood's so heavy. It's been waiting." "How deep?" said Eri. "Under that one? 34 meters before it hits sky." He said it the way another man might say, just past the post office. It came up through a floor and a foundation and 2 feet of poured concrete, and it didn't stop and check whether it was allowed. Because that's the whole thing about trees. That's the only thing you have to know about them. He turned around and looked up at her, and his eyes were huge and shining, which was their resting state. They don't argue with the concrete. They don't ask it to move, they just go where the light is. She turned that over. That's all? She said. That's all. Every single time. It's the same for a 900-year-old oak, and it's the same for a weed in a parking lot, and the weed always wins, which is my favorite thing that happens on this planet. He picked up a rice ball and held it out sideways without looking at her, so she could take it or leave it, and after a moment she took it. You put a slab of stone over a seed, and the seed will spend 4 years figuring out the crack. 4 years. That's the patience of a green thing. And then it goes through, and after that, the slab is the seed's problem, and the slab has lost. Eri ate about a third of the rice ball. "Can we go outside?" she said. Izuku Midoriya's face did something that would have been visible from an aircraft. They went at 5:47. Ibara Shiozaki met them at the stairwell in a borrowed coat 3 sizes too big. It belonged to one of the paramedics, and she had put it on over her sleep clothes without comment, and her vines were still loose and heavy from sleeping, drifting behind her shoulders like waterweed. She had been awake since 5. She had been awake since 5 because at some point around 2 in the morning, she had said 4 words on a rooftop in a tree that had no business existing. And she had spent the hours since then lying on her back in a strange room, listening to a boy 2 doors down sniffling into a pillow with what she was fairly sure was joy, and turning the words over to see whether she would take any of them back. She wouldn't. That was the whole finding of the night. She came down the stairs, and Izuku looked up at her, and his ears went red, and he opened his mouth, and Eri was holding his hand, so he closed it again and said, "Good morning," in a voice about an octave off from usual. "Good morning," said Ibara. That was it. That was all of it. Neither of them said one word about the rooftop because they had spent 2 months building a habit of saying nothing at each other for 40 minutes at a time and understanding every syllable of it. And because 6-year-olds notice everything. They went out through the loading door and across the taped-off street and in under the trees. The forest at the edge of the Hasei Kai site was 6 hours old and behaved like it had been there since before Nagoya. The canopy came together 80 meters up and made the light green. There were roots the width of train cars running out from the base of the compound, and moss had already found them. And something in the branches was making a 2-note call over and over, which Izuku identified without looking up as a bull-headed shrike and got emotional about. Eri stopped about 4 steps in. She stopped the way small animals stop, with her whole body, and Izuku stopped with her instantly and went down on his heels, so his head was lower than hers, and Ibara halted 2 paces back and said nothing at all. Eri was looking at a tree. It was a camphor, and it was maybe 2 meters across at the base, and it had a spiral of bark that ran up it like a rope, and it was breathing. She could see it, the almost nothing motion of a living thing in still air, leaves at the top, turning over one at a time. Everything she had ever touched had either been given to her or taken from her. She had been handed things. She had been made to hold things. She had touched a great many people because they made her, and she had touched exactly nothing in 900 days because she wanted to. She put out one hand. It shook. She got it to within a centimeter of the bark, and it stopped there, and Izuku did not say a word. He stayed down on his heels in the leaf litter with his hands on his knees, and he did not reach out and guide her hand. And later, that would turn out to be one of the 3 or 4 most important decisions of his life. Eri touched the tree. Her palm went flat on the bark. She flinched. Reflex. A whole body braced for the thing that always came after touching, and nothing came after it. The bark was rough and cool and faintly damp, and it stayed exactly where it was. She didn't take her hand away. She stood there for 11 seconds with her palm on a 900-year-old camphor tree in the middle of the wreckage of the place she had been kept. And behind her, the sun came up over the eastern rooftops and put one long bar of gold in through the trunks. And it hit the moss, and the moss went the color of a lit window. "Oh," said Eri. Ibara Shiozaki put both hands over her mouth and turned her face away, and one of her vines wrapped itself twice around her own wrist and held on. Izuku Midoriya cried so hard he had to sit down in the dirt. "I'm fine," he said, waving a hand. I'm fine. I'm Eri. Keep going. Don't mind me. This is just what I do. He does do that, Ibara said. Is he broken? Said Eri. Profoundly. The rest of it was the world catching up, and the world took about 3 weeks. The footage of the Hasaikai lift ran on every channel in Japan for 72 hours without a break, and then it kept running, and then it went into a permanent slot on the evening news under a graphic. There were 4 usable angles. The best of them was from a traffic camera 2 blocks south that had survived because the roots had grown around its pole instead of through it. And what it showed was a hill becoming a mountain, and the mountain becoming a forest, and a 12,000 square meter subterranean fortress coming out of the ground like a tooth, sunlight falling down into hallways that had been sealed since before the boy who opened them could read. By the end of the first week, there were 3 government agencies drafting documentation for it, and all 3 of them ran into the same wall, which was that they had no box. The Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport wanted to classify the root structure as an unpermitted construction, which would have required a permit holder, which would have required the permit holder to be a licensed engineering entity, which he was, in that he was carrying a provisional hero license and had apologized to the Municipal Engineering Office in person on the afternoon of the incident while covered in blood that wasn't his. The Ministry of the Environment wanted the site declared a protected biotope, which it plainly was, because there were nesting birds in it by day 4 and a family of tanuki by day 9, and because the survey team sent to core sample the trunks came back with ring counts that made one of them go and sit in the van. The Hero Public Safety Commission wanted, above all, for somebody else to handle it. The working group they had recommended on page 9 of the incident report convened 11 days after the raid and became a committee in one afternoon. The committee became an emergency session inside a week because a reporter got hold of the phrase somebody had written on a whiteboard and put it on television, extraordinary civilian infrastructure asset. It went badly. It went badly in a way that generated 41 minutes of parliamentary questioning and a public statement, because the country had watched a 15-year-old take his coat off and put it around a child, and there was a general feeling expressed at volume that a nation which responded to that by writing asset on a whiteboard had lost the thread. The emergency session became a commission on the 22nd day. It had a 12-page mandate. Nobody who sat on it was happy with a single word of the working title, and the chair, a man named Kubo, who had spent 19 years drafting hero legislation and had never once been frightened by a document, opened the first meeting by putting his hands flat on the table and saying, "I want it on the record that I don't know what we're doing." "Noted," said the secretary. "I want it on the record twice." Enji Todoroki watched the footage in his own living room with the lights off. He watched it the way he watched everything, which was as an assessment. He had been the number 2 hero for a decade, and then the number 1 for 4 months, and he had built his entire understanding of himself on a very good internal sense of where he sat on any scale you cared to draw. This man is above me. That man is below me. That creature would take 11 minutes and cost me a rib. He had fought things that ate through Musutafu's northern district. He had put down a Nomu in Kyushu that took 4 heroes and a helicopter. He watched the wood human rise out of the exposed foundation of the Hasaikai compound to 60 meters. And he watched 9 stone spikes fired from 9 arms burst against its open palms. And he watched it punch a man so hard that the fusion came apart. And 3 unconscious bodies went out sideways in a cone. And then he watched a boy in green come down its arm and drop the last few meters and cross the rubble at a walk and take his coat off. Enji Todoroki sat with his hands on his knees in the blue light of a paused frame and did the math. He did it honestly, because he had stopped lying to himself about several large things over the last few months, and the habit had become general. He gave himself full mobility and full output and the terrain of his choosing. He gave himself prominence burn at maximum, which would take the front off a building. He gave the boy nothing but time to put his palms on the ground, which was, in practice, all he had ever needed. He got to a number and looked at it and put his face in one hand. Said Enji Todoroki. Shoto came into the room 40 minutes later and found his father sitting in the glow of a television playing the same 9 seconds on a loop and asked if he was all right. "Your classmate," said Endeavor. "Midoriya, the green one." "That's Midoriya." Endeavor gestured at the screen with 2 fingers. "This is the one who shouted at you in the stadium." "He told me I was freezing my own heart," Shoto said, "in front of 71 million people. Then he grew a forest through the drainage system and hugged me." His father was silent for a while. "Are we friends with him?" Endeavor said Shoto considered the question with the whole of his attention because it was the strangest thing his father had ever asked him. "He is friends with everyone," he said. "That's the mechanism. There's no opting out." Shota Aizawa came back to UA on the 24th day with his arms out of the full casts and into braces, moving like a man made out of coat hangers. And he read the 406-page report in one morning at his desk, with a can of coffee going cold at his elbow. Then he had Izuku Midoriya sent to his office. The boy arrived with sawdust in his hair and a smear of wet clay up one forearm, because at 7 that morning, he had started something behind Building B and hadn't told anybody what it was. He sat down in the chair without being asked, and then apologized for sitting down without being asked, and then noticed the coffee had gone cold and offered to go and get a fresh one, and Aizawa said, "Sit," and he sat. Aizawa looked at him for a long moment. He had a great many things he could have said. He drafted about 9 of them over 11 days in a hospital bed, and every one of them had turned to paper in his hands, because you cannot give a safety lecture to a child who lifted a criminal empire out of the ground in 5 seconds and then stayed on site for 3 hours so that it wouldn't fall on anybody later. There was no lever. There was nothing to threaten and nothing to withhold and nothing to teach, in the sense that he understood teaching, which was the transfer of a technique from a person who has it to a person who lacks it. So he looked at the boy's face instead and saw that it was thinner than it had been in April, and that there were hollows under the eyes where the marks came in, and he threw the 9 speeches away. "You've lost 4 kilos since the internship," he said. "Have I?" "Recovery girl weighed you. She sent me a note. The note had underlining on it." Aizawa leaned back, which hurt, and let it hurt. "You put out 480,000 tons of displacement in 5 seconds and then spent 3 hours on maintenance work and then ate 4 dinners, and you thought 4 dinners covered it." It felt like it covered it. It didn't. Aizawa held his eyes. "Eat more. Chakra runs on the body it lives in. Feed it." Izuku Midoriya sat very still. Then his face came apart into the most sincere expression in the building, and he said, "Yes, sensei," with both hands on his knees and his back straight, and he went directly to the cafeteria and ate 4 bowls of rice before foundational hero studies, and then a 5th one during, from a bowl he had brought with him, which Aizawa allowed because he brought it on his teacher's instruction, and there was nothing to be done. Class 1A took on Eri Chisaki, the way a river takes on a stone, which is to say around and immediately and with a great deal of noise. She had been placed in a supervised residential program at UA, a decision that had taken 8 hours, 4 signatures, and 1 very short conversation in which Nezu had asked the commission whether they would prefer the child be housed at a facility 3 prefectures away from the only person on Earth she was willing to be in a room with. And the commission had elected to stop talking. Kirishima was excellent from the first hour. That surprised nobody who knew him, and it surprised Kirishima. He simply sat down on the floor at a distance. She showed her his hardening on 1 finger, let her poke it, made a joke about being a rock, laughed at his own joke louder than the joke deserved, and by the end of the week, she was following him around the common room in total silence, like a small, determined shadow. Kaminari was nervous for 3 days because he'd been told to be gentle and had interpreted this as a technical requirement. And then on the 4th day, he dropped an entire tray of curry on himself, and she laughed. The first laugh anybody at UA heard out of her, a startled little bark of a thing that stopped the whole room. And after that, he wasn't nervous again. Uraraka taught her to float a spoon. Yaoyorozu made her a stuffed rabbit out of her own forearm, and then a second one when she saw how the first one was being held. Tokoyami sat with her for an hour and a half one evening, and neither of them said a word, and both of them appeared to consider it a success. Ashido painted her nails. Ida drew up a schedule and laminated it, and she carried the laminated schedule around for 2 weeks. And Ida found out and had to leave the room. Katsuki Bakugo did not speak to her. He did not speak to her on the first day, and he did not speak to her on the second. And when she came into the common room, he tended to go out of it. And Kirishima noticed and said nothing, because he had learned over one very long year when to say nothing. On the third morning, there was a cup of broth on the windowsill of her room. It was warm. It was in a plain cup with a chip out of the rim, and it had been left there sometime before 6. And nobody admitted to leaving it, and nobody asked twice, because Aizawa came through the corridor at 6:10 and saw it, and then saw the boy going the other way at the far end of the hall with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders up around his ears. And Aizawa took out his ledger and wrote one line in it and put the ledger away and never mentioned it to a living soul. There was a cup on the sill the next morning too, and the morning after that. And then it was simply a thing that happened, the way weather happens. And by the second week, Eri had begun leaving the cup out on the sill, washed, upside down. And by the third week, there was a small wooden thing next to the cup that Izuku had grown at her request in about 9 seconds, and that she wouldn't explain. And one morning, the small wooden thing was gone, and Bakugo Katsuki went through the entire day with his hand in his pocket. Izuku and Ibara told nobody anything. That was the plan. And they stuck to it, and it made absolutely no difference at all. Because you cannot hide something like that in a building with 20 teenagers in it. The class worked it out over 11 days by accumulation. His eyes found her in a room before he knew he was looking. He'd be mid-sentence with Sero about tape tensile strength, and his head would come around 40 degrees for no reason, and then come back, and Sero would lose his place in the conversation. Her vines drifted toward him when he came near, all on their own, reaching about a hand's width before she caught them and pulled them in with a particular flat expression and a particular color rising up her neck. He grew things. That was the loudest tell. There was suddenly a bench on the meditation slope that fit exactly 2 people sitting close, with a slight lean in the back that put your shoulders together, and none of them had seen him make it. There was a white plum flower outside her dormitory window on a stem that came up out of the wall, and it hadn't been there at midnight. And the next week there were 4. Mina Ashido, who had been running an unofficial ledger since April, closed her book on the 11th day and said, "Called it," to nobody. Kirishima was the one who actually caught them on a Wednesday evening, coming up the meditation slope at a jog to ask Izuku about a lifting technique. They were sitting on the bench in the last of the light. They weren't talking. They weren't looking at each other. Her right hand and his left hand were both flat on the wood of the seat between them, and the distance between them was maybe 1.5 centimeters, and neither of them was moving at all. And the grass around the bench was standing up in a ring and bowing away, and every green thing on that hillside was leaning in toward the 2 of them like a room full of people trying to overhear something. Kirishima Eijiro stopped dead. He went white. He performed a complete reversal in one motion without producing a single sound, got 4 steps and went over Sero Hanta, who had come up the slope behind him. They both went down. There was a lot of noise. "Bro, back. What is happening?" "Nothing's happening." "We saw nothing. We're going to dinner." On the bench, Ibara Shiozaki closed her eyes and breathed out through her nose. "Should we say something?" Izuku said. "They'll tell each other. It's more efficient." She opened her eyes. Her hand had not moved. "Also, I believe Ashido has money on it." "On what?" "On the date." "There's a date?" "There's a spreadsheet," said Ibara. He laughed so loud that a heron came off the reservoir 400 meters away, and she watched him do it with an expression she wouldn't have let anyone else in the world see. And one of her vines came all the way over and looped once around his wrist before she could stop it. And she elected, on reflection, to stop trying. The joint training exercise between Class 1A and Class 1B was scheduled for the second week of the summer term and then rescheduled twice because two separate bodies wanted things from it. Vlad King wanted it because his class had spent a year being the other class and were, to a man, sick of it. Aizawa wanted it because his class had spent a year growing sideways in the shade of one enormous tree and needed a day of hard contact against people who had trained for exactly them. And the Hero Public Safety Commission wanted it because the commission with the 12-page mandate had reached the part of its process where it required assessment data. And assessment data on Izuku Midoriya did not exist in any usable form because every recorded engagement he had ever been in had ended before instruments could take a reading. The commission's request was worded with enormous care and arrived in a sealed envelope. Aizawa read it, said one word into the middle distance, and put Izuku in the sixth and final round. The format was 6 rounds of elimination on ground gamma, teams drawn on the morning, and both classes turned up at 8 and stood on opposite sides of the field, looking at each other, and Class 1B had brought paper. That was the thing 1A noticed first. Kendo Itsuka had a folder. Hananuki had annotated diagrams. Shota Narengeki had a tablet and a stylus, and a set of numbers he'd worked out with a physics teacher over 3 weekends. And Nato Monoma, who normally opened these occasions with a monologue, was standing at the back with his arms crossed and his mouth shut. And that was more unsettling than anything he could have said. They had watched the Hasaikai footage. All of them. Repeatedly. They had watched the traffic camera angle in slow motion, and they had gone through the seismograph traces published in an open access journal by a woman at Kyushu who had been laughed out of 2 conferences and was now the most cited Quirk researcher in Asia. And they had come to the field with strategies, and none of them thought for 1 second that the strategies would work. They had come anyway. Vlad King had never been prouder of anything in his life. Round 1 was Kaminari and Ashido against Tsuburaba and Rin, and it went 11 minutes, which surprised everybody, including the 4 people in it. Tsuburaba boxed Kaminari in with solid air twice, and Kaminari blew both boxes out from inside and lost most of his sense in the process, wandering the concrete corridors with his thumbs up, while Ashido carried the entire tactical load. She won it in the end by going up. She put acid through a support column at an angle she'd worked out in her head, dropped a walkway on Rin's scale barrage, and took Tsuburaba out of the air with a thrown slug of pure output while she was still falling. And she landed badly and sprained a wrist and won, and the observation deck came off the rails. Round 2 went to 1B, hard. Hananuki Juzo took Sato and Koda apart on ground he had made into soup in the first 30 seconds, and there was nothing anybody could do about it. Sato's strength did nothing against a floor that had stopped being a floor, and Koda's animals wouldn't come near it. It was the cleanest single performance of the day, and Hananuki walked off the field having not been touched, and 1B made a sound that had a whole year of second place in it. Round 3 was the one people talked about afterward, Ibara Shiozaki and Fumikage Tokoyami against Setsuna Tokage and Togaru Kamakiri. It was ugly, and it was fast, and it was genuinely, honestly, brilliant on all 4 sides. Tokage came apart into 30 flying pieces the second the whistle went and attacked from every compass point at once, and Kamakiri went straight down the middle with a blade growing out of each forearm and the specific intention of getting into vine range and staying there, because he had watched the tapes and worked out that vines have a length at which they are strongest, and he wanted to be inside it. He got inside it. That was the thing. He got inside it in 4 seconds, and he really cut 3 severing strokes that took 9 centimeters off her reach and put blood on her shoulder. And Ibara Shiozaki did not retreat 1 step. She dropped her whole hair, everything, all at once, 4 meters of it in every direction, and she used the mass rather than the reach, folding it in on him in overlapping layers and taking the blades in the outermost of them. And while he was cutting through green, she put her hands together and prayed, which is a thing that looks like doing nothing and is in fact a way of going all the way down inside yourself in half a second. The vines went dense. They went past dense into something like cable. Kamakiri got 3 more cuts and then found that he was cutting into a mass that closed faster than he could open it, and then found he couldn't move his elbow, and then that he couldn't move at all. Tokoyami handled the pieces of Tokage, which was the hardest defensive assignment of the day, and he handled it by standing back to back with Ibara and letting Dark Shadow run a perimeter. And the two of them held that circle for 6 minutes, while 30 independent hands and feet and 1 grinning severed head came at them out of the concrete maze. Ibara took Tokage in the end. She did it by working out, correctly, that the head had to be within a certain distance to coordinate, and by growing a lattice across the only 3 approach lines that put it there. And when the head came through the middle one at speed, she caught it in a cage of her own hair and held it up at arm's length, while the other 29 pieces went limp all across the field. "That was rude," said Setsuna Tokage's head. "I apologize," said Ibara, and bowed with the head still held out. On the observation deck, Izuku Midoriya was standing on a bench with both fists in the air, screaming her name at a volume that made the glass buzz, and crying so hard that Yaoyorozu had to hand him a handkerchief she made on the spot. "Momo, she planned the lattice. Did you see she planned it 3 minutes before she needed it?" "I saw. She prayed in the middle of a knife fight. Midoriya, please get off the bench." Round 4 went to Bakugo and Kirishima in 91 seconds, which the observers noted with a footnote about escalation of force. Round 5 went to Yaoyorozu and Jiro, on a plan that took 4 minutes to set up and 11 seconds to execute, and Yaoyorozu walked off the field with her chin up and both her classmates and 1B applauding, and that mattered to her more than she said, which brought them to round 6. Ground Gamma had been rebuilt twice that year, and the maintenance staff had been informed of the schedule, and there is a document in the UA facilities office still with the words "do not repair" until Friday on it in Nezu's terrible handwriting. The commission's observers came down from the deck and set up at the fence line, 4 of them with instruments on tripods and 1 man holding a barometer for reasons he later declined to explain. The class stacked up along the rail. Aizawa stood at the end of it with his braced arms folded as well as they would fold. 3 students walked out onto the field. Neito Monoma in the center, with his gloves off. Shota Narengeki on the left, who had a quirk that put a second impact behind every first one and had spent 3 weeks working out that a root network is a single continuous structure, and that a single continuous structure has resonance, and had numbers and believed in his numbers. And Kinoko Komori on the right, in her hood, who had run the actual laboratory work, who had gone to the forestry department at a university in Kobe and asked what breaks down heartwood, and been given an answer and gone away and grown it. They faced 1 boy in a gray tracksuit who waved at them. "Hi," he called. "You brought paper." "I saw the paper. That's so good. Nobody ever brings paper." "Midoriya," said Monoma. "I read Shota's thing, the resonance thing." Izuku was walking toward them, hands loose, absolutely beaming. "You're right, by the way. That's the actual weak point. If you put a standing wave through a connected network at the right frequency, you can break cohesion at the joins, and then the whole thing has to reknit from the middle out. And that costs me maybe half a second, which is real. That's genuinely real." "Who did you work with?" Shota Nirengeki opened his mouth and closed it. "Nakajima-sensei," he said. "Physics. I'm going to write him a letter." "Please start," said Monoma. Present Mike's voice came down off the deck, and the field went live, and the 3 of them moved. They got 40 seconds, and they used them well. Komori went first, wide left, and put a cloud of spores out along the ground in a fan, and it wasn't for cover, it was seeding. Shota went straight in on a diagonal, low and fast, and hit the concrete with the flat of his hand as he came so that the impact ran out ahead of him and doubled, and the ground shivered. Monoma came up the center at a dead sprint with 1 hand out, and no plan beyond the obvious. Izuku let him touch him. That was the thing the commission's instruments caught, and the classmates on the rail did not. He let it happen. He turned his shoulder infractionally so that Monoma's palm landed flat on his bare forearm, rather than glancing off the tracksuit, and he did it with the interest of a man holding a door open for somebody carrying boxes. Neito Monoma copied the quirk. His face changed at once. Not the way faces change in a fight, This was something else, something total. The expression of a man who has opened a door in his own house expecting a cupboard and found the sea. He staggered. He got 3 more steps and his knees went. Because a copy quirk copies the ability, and it does not copy the vessel. And Nato Monoma's body had been built by 15 years of ordinary living. And what came in through his palm was the pressure of every root and every seed and every buried leaf under 6 hectares of musutafu, plus the water table, plus 1,000 years of dead forest pressed flat into clay, plus the slow, enormous grinding heat of a continental plate. And all of it arrived at once into a chest cavity built for a boy. Blood came out of his nose in a sheet. His ears popped and then bled a little. Something behind his eyes went white, and there was a roaring in it that had a shape, and the shape was large, and he was aware for 4 full seconds of being a very small thing standing on top of something that had been there before there were things to stand. He got one hand down to the ground because the reflex was in the quirk, and the quirk was screaming to be used. A sapling came up under his palm. One sapling, about the height of a chair with 9 leaves on it. Then the copy hit its ceiling and folded at the 40-second mark, and Monoma sound in the grass with his hands in his lap. Shota and Komori kept going because they were professionals about it and because the round hadn't been called. Shota got his standing wave. He got it in the 11th second, and it worked. The field rang, a low note that everybody on the deck felt in their teeth. And out in the middle of ground gamma, a root network the size of a city block lost cohesion at every joint simultaneously and had to reknit. And for half a second, the ground under Izuku Midoriya was made of gravel and disagreement. Izuku moved. The whole rail saw it and made a sound because he hadn't moved in the Hasaikai footage, and he hadn't moved at the sports festival, and he hadn't moved at the USJ, and they had begun to hold a private idea about him that had stillness in it, and here he was actually crossing 30 meters of broken concrete at a run. "He's moving," said Ojiro. "Note it," said one of the commission's observers in a voice like a man pulling a fire alarm. "Note the time, note the technique, note that he had to." Izuku took Shota Nirengeki out in 8 seconds. He came in on his blind side, and instead of growing anything from the ground, which was the thing being disrupted, he put his palm flat on Shota's own shoulder and grew from there. A root came out of the boy's shirt collar, not through him, past him. It came off Izuku's hand, wrapped the arm, went down and around and rooted itself into the concrete behind him and hauled him back against a support pillar and closed 3 loops around the chest and 1 around each wrist and 1 over the palms, because the palms were the whole quirk. "That was so smart," Izuku said in his face, delighted, while Shota hung there. "The wave. Where did you get the frequency?" "Get off. You had to model the root density, right? You had to guess how deep. Midoriya, I'm still in the round. Sorry. He stepped back and put his hands up and then jogged away sideways and called over his shoulder, "You made me run. Nobody makes me run." Kinoko Komori got 2 minutes and 11 seconds. She earned every one of them. She had understood something the other 2 hadn't, which was that you don't fight a forest by hitting it. You fight it by giving it a disease. She had spent 3 weeks growing a strain, and she seeded the whole eastern third of ground gamma with it, and then went to ground in a drainage channel and waited. And when the trees came for her, the fungus was already in the soil, and it took. 3 saplings went to pulp in front of the commission's cameras. Not broken, eaten, the fiber breaking down into wet gray slurry in under 9 seconds, a hyphal mat crawling up the bark of a 4th one and taking the leaves off it from the stem outward. On the deck, Aizawa's head came around 1 degree. Out in the field, Izuku Midoriya stopped and looked at it and said, with total sincerity, "Oh, that's horrible." Then he crouched and put both palms flat and stopped growing trees. He grew the ground instead. Roots ran under the seeded zone at 4 meters depth and lifted it. The whole eastern third of the field, topsoil and fungal mat and all, came up in 1 intact slab and folded over on itself like a closing book, sealing every spore inside a pocket of clay and pressing it shut. And then the earth opened directly beneath the drainage channel, and Kinoko Komori dropped about 1.5 meters and landed on her feet. And 4 walls came up around her at once, and the 5th came over the top, and it was done. Class 1A wins round 6, said Present Mike, in the tone of a man reading a card because it was in his hand. Nobody on the deck was talking about the result. The commission's man with the barometer was looking at his instrument. His colleague at the seismograph terminal had stopped writing and was holding the printout with 2 hands. Their projection model for this student, a document 40 pages long, prepared over 6 weeks with tiers and margins and a section on containment, had a top band on it labeled upper bound of plausible output, and the numbers coming off ground gamma had gone through the top band and out the other side inside 2 minutes in a training exercise against 3 16-year-olds, while the subject apologized to one of them about a fungus. "We're going to need a new model," said the seismograph man. "We're going to need a new unit," said the barometer man. Izuku Midoriya went and let all 3 of them out personally. He got Komori out of the box first and told her, crouched down at her eye level with his hands on his knees and his eyes wet, that what she had done was the single most dangerous thing anybody had ever done to him, and that she should keep going with it, and that she should absolutely never stop, and that if she ever wanted to walk a real forest with him and see what a healthy root system smelled like, she should just say. Kinoko Komori went the color of a stop sign inside her hood and said, "Okay," in a voice like a mouse. He got Shota down off the pillar and then stood there for 6 minutes talking about frequency until Kendo came and physically removed him. And then he came and crouched down in the grass next to Nato Monoma, who was still sitting there with blood drying on his chin, looking up. The canopy over the middle of ground gamma was 11 seconds old and 60 meters high and full of light coming through in moving patches. "You felt it," Izuku said. "What?" Monoma said. "The planet. While you had it, you felt what it feels like." Monoma turned his head and looked at him. He had spent a year being funny at Class 1A, and the funny came from a real place, which was that he had a quirk that only worked on other people, and he had built a personality on top of that whole. He had touched about 400 people in his life and taken their gifts for 5 minutes each. And he knew exactly what it was like to be Itsuka Kendo and exactly what it was like to be Eijiro Kirishima, and he had never once been afraid of what came through his hand. "There's a lot of it," Monoma said. "Yeah," Izuku said. "There really is." Monoma looked back up at the leaves. "How do you sleep?" he said. "On my front, mostly. Mom says I snore." Izuku got up and put a hand out, and Monoma took it and was pulled to his feet like a bag of laundry. "Your sapling's still there, by the way, over by the fence. 9 leaves. That's a real tree now, and it's going to be there in 90 years, and you grew it, so if you ever want to come back and see it, it's my tree? Whose else would it be?" Nato Monoma went and looked at his tree for 11 minutes and told nobody why he was late for lunch. At the back of the observation deck, arms crossed, Katsuki Bakugo had watched the whole thing without saying one word. Kirishima glanced over twice. He had known this boy since April, and he had a fairly good map of him by now. The map had a lot of shouting on it, and the thing he saw on his friend's face, while a green-haired lunatic stood in the middle of a ruined training ring ground, apologizing to a girl about mushrooms, was something he'd never charted. Bakugo watched until the field was clear. Then, he pushed off the rail and went down the stairs, and he went out to the fence line, and he stood in front of a 9-leaved sapling for a while, and then he went to the gym and put 410 kilograms on the leg press, which was 30 more than he had ever done, and did it 11 times and threw up in the bin and did it once more. The autumn was long and warm and full of small things. There was a flower outside Ibarra's window, and then a stem with 4 of them. And then, in the second week of October, a whole low wall of white plum running along under the sill out of the brickwork, flowering 3 months out of season and refusing to be reasoned with. She came back from morning prayer to find Hagakure and Ashido standing in the courtyard below it, taking photographs. "Shiozaki," said Ashido, "your building's in love with you." "That's the trellis, is it?" said Ibarra. "That is a wall of plum blossom growing out of a load-bearing wall." "Then I'll thank the wall." There was the bench on the slope, and the bench got a back, and then the back got a slight lean, and then one evening in November, there was a small roof over it made of interlaced branches with the leaves still on, because it had rained on them the week before, and he had thought about it for 8 days. There was the garden behind Building B. He never announced it. That was the thing about the garden. There was no moment where he said, "I am making a garden." There was simply a strip of dead ground behind the 3rd dormitory where the maintenance crews used to park, and then there was clay turned over in it, and then there were 4 fruit trees in a curve, and then a gravel path that he laid by hand over 3 weekends because he wanted it to be gravel he had carried rather than gravel he had grown, and then a hedge, and then a low bank, and then in the last week of November, there was a hollow shape in the ground at the far end, about 6 meters across, sloping and lined with pressed clay. Eri worked out what it was before anybody else did. "That's a hole," she said. "That's the beginning of a hole." "Why?" Izuku Midoriya sat back on his heels in the dirt with his hands filthy to the elbow and looked at the hollow with the specific expression of a man who has been given a job and intends to do it correctly. "Because somebody told me a pond would be nice," he said. Eri Chisaki looked at the hollow for a while. "Fish?" she said. "Eventually fish." "What kind?" "I don't know yet. That's a whole conversation. That's a big conversation, actually. We should sit down and do it properly. Do you want to do it now?" They did it then. It took 1 hour and 11 minutes, most of it on the question of whether fish get cold, and Ibarra came out at the end of it with 3 cups of tea and found the 2 of them lying flat on their stomachs at the edge of a dry hole in the ground, arguing. The League of Villains stopped being the League of Villains sometime in that same autumn, and the change was structural, and it happened out of sight. What went in was a boy with hands on him and 11 followers and a grudge. What came out 4 months later was an organization with cells in 6 prefectures, a front operating as a labor rights movement, a doctor with a laboratory under a mountain, 300 people who had signed up because a man had told them the truth about the country they lived in, and in a cavern in the Kyushu Highlands, 500 tons of something that had been asleep for a very long time and was beginning to move in its sleep. Gigantomachia had been dreaming about a voice since 1998. It was a simple loyalty, and it ran the whole depth of the creature. One man had spoken to it once, and it had spent the rest of its existence waiting for that voice to speak again. And when Shigaraki Tomura came into the cave and stood in front of it and said a name that was not his own, the mountain shifted. The awakening took 4 months, and Shigaraki did it on a promise. That was the deal. In the end, the creature agreed to consider him, and it would keep considering him until it decided, and if it decided against him, it would fold him into the rock. He walked into that cave 9 times. He came out of it 9 times, and each time there was less of the boy who had scratched his own neck at the USJ, and more of something that had been sitting patiently behind his eyes, waiting for the room. Because All for One had never been in the room, and that was the part nobody understood until much later. He had spent decades learning that presence is the most expensive thing a man can spend, and he had stopped spending it. There was a version of him in a cell at Tartarus, restrained by 9 separate systems and monitored on 4-hour rotation, and it breathed, and it ate, and once a month it said something unpleasant to a guard, and it was a shell of grown flesh with a copied quirk factor threaded into it, and had been passing inspection for 2 years and 1 month. The original had watched everything from a distance through a boy's eyes, and had invested in that boy the way a man invests in a house he intends to live in, and had waited. The announcement came in December. It came at a Hero Association regional facility outside Fukuoka at 4 in the afternoon on a workday with 3 television crews in the car park because somebody had tipped them off, which was the whole point. They didn't destroy it. Everybody afterward found that the most frightening part, 61 operatives came out of 11 warp gates and took the building in 9 minutes and put every hero in it face down on the tiles without killing one of them. And then Shigaraki Tomura walked out onto the front steps in front of 3 cameras with his hands loose at his sides and made a statement that ran 2 minutes and 40 seconds and had in it 1 sentence that got repeated on every channel in Japan for a week. You have been living in a house held up by 1 pillar, and you never once asked what happens when we take it out. Then the gates opened, and they were gone. And every hero in the building woke up, and the facility was intact. And there was a hole in the national mood that nothing filled for a month. Izuku Midoriya watched the broadcast in the common room with 19 classmates around him and a 6-year-old asleep against his side, and he didn't say anything at all. And Ibara Shiozaki, sitting on the floor with her back against the sofa, felt the temperature in the room change and put a hand up onto his knee without looking. He stopped in the middle of a sentence on a Thursday, 6 days later. They were walking the third-floor corridor of the dormitory in the late afternoon, and he was telling her about a technique his hands had worked out on their own in the shower that morning. And he got as far as, and the thing is, if you seed it before you need it, then when you call it up, you're all ready. And then he stopped walking, and his mouth stayed open, and his eyes went past her and past the wall and past everything. Both palms turned out and went flat at his sides, an arm's length from the plaster, fingers spread. Ibara stopped too. She knew this state. She had watched him do it 4 times now. Once on the slope, once in a train station, once in the middle of a shopping street in Hosu. And she had learned that the correct response was to become still and let him listen. Her vines pulled in tight against her shoulders all the same. They did that on their own. They always did that when he did this. 11 seconds went by. "The ground is agitated," he said. She waited. He turned his head slightly as if adjusting a dial. There's a mass. There's a very big mass moving under the country, and it's been sitting still for a long time, and it isn't sitting still anymore, and his fingers press the air. Kyushu. It's south. It's coming up out of rock, and it's heavy, Ibara. It's heavy the way a hill is heavy, and it's walking. How far away? Far. Weeks, maybe. It stops and starts. His eyes came back into the corridor and found her. Something's moving under the country, something that's been waiting a long time. Ibara Shiozaki looked at him. Is it coming here? Everything comes here, Izuku said, with no particular weight on it, which was somehow the worst thing he could have said. He went out to the slope at 9 that night and put both palms in the frozen grass and stayed there for 3 hours. She watched from her window for the first hour. There was frost on the hill, and the frost around him melted in a ring. And after a while, she couldn't see him at all because the mist came up out of the warm ground and stood on the slope in a column. And the last thing she saw before it closed over him was the 2 lines coming in under his eyes, red-brown in the moonlight, pulsing slow like something with a heartbeat. He came into the kitchen at 11 minutes past 2. She was sitting at the table with a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, in a cardigan over her sleep clothes, hair loose down her back and drifting. He didn't ask why she was awake. He went to the refrigerator and ate everything in it. A bowl of rice, 4 eggs, cold chicken, a whole cucumber, half a block of tofu with his fingers, 2 bananas, and a container of Sato's pudding that he replaced the next day with an apology note. And then he sat down across from her with his hands around a glass of milk and told her. "It's bigger than I thought," he said. "The mass. And it's not the only thing." He turned the glass a quarter turn. "There's something else down there, something old that isn't in one place. It's like when you find a root under a garden and you follow it and it goes under the fence and under the road and you realize the tree isn't in your garden at all. It's 4 streets over. And it's been drinking out of your soil the whole time, and you never knew." Ibara went cold from the collarbone down. "How old?" "Old like a person can be old, not like a rock." He looked up at her. "That's what I don't like. Rocks I understand." Neither of them said anything for a while. The refrigerator hummed. "It's coming," he said. "The storm. It's going to be enormous, and it's going to take a lot from a lot of people, and I've felt the shape of it for 6 days now." He drank about 1/3 of the milk. "And I'm ready. I want you to know that part first before anything else. I've been growing seeds under this whole city since September. Under Musutafu, under the highway, under the hospital district, 3 meters down. Dormant. Thousands of them. And nobody knows, and nobody can find them, and they're just sitting there waiting for me to say the word. I've been getting ready since the day I felt the first tremor." He set the glass down, "So whatever comes, it's arriving into a place I've already built." Ibara Shiozaki reached across the kitchen table and took his hand. She did not tell him to be careful. She had grown up in a house full of scripture, and one of the things scripture teaches you, if you read it honestly, is which words are useless in which rooms, and careful is a word you say to a person crossing a road. It is not a word you say to a mountain the night before the weather changes. "Come back to me," she said. Izuku Midoriya turned his hand over inside hers. "Of course," he said. "You haven't seen the pond yet." The League tested him 11 days later in Hosu on a night patrol. He had been out with Kamui Woods on the outer ward route because the internship program had extended into a standing arrangement, and Ibara was 2 streets over with a police liaison, and it was 10:30 and raining lightly, and the League sent 7 people. They were good. That was the honest assessment in the report, and Kamui Woods insisted on the wording. 7 mid-level operatives with well-matched quirks, deployed by somebody who had actually done the work, a hardening type to lead, 2 long range, a sound suppressor to keep the engagement off the police net, a woman who could turn her own body to a gel that couldn't be gripped, and 2 with cutting quirks whose only job was to test whether the boy's skin could be opened at all. They had dossiers, they had a strategy with 3 branches in it. They had been told explicitly that they were probing, get a reading on his response time, get a reading on how long it takes him to bring up the marks, do not attempt to kill him, and if the marks come in, run. They came out of an alley mouth on Kakegawa Street in formation, and the woman in front, a hardening type called Hanabata, who had led 4 operations and never lost anyone, got as far as opening her mouth. "Hero student, we have a message for." He was already in sage mode. That was the thing the League learned that night, and it cost them the entire assessment. There was no activation threshold, because he had been gathering since he felt the pressure change in the drains 2 blocks back, and he had walked 70 meters with the whole of it held still under his skin like a man carrying a full cup, and the marks came in under his eyes the way a light comes on. 11 seconds. Roots came out of the drain pipes on both sides of the street, out of the curb joints, out of the mortar between bricks 4 floors up, out of the seams in the asphalt, and they didn't grope. They arrived. The hardening type went into the wall first, wrists and ankles and throat, and her hardening held perfectly and made absolutely no difference because nothing was trying to break her. The gel woman couldn't be gripped and was therefore contained instead. A wooden vessel formed around her in a 1.5 seconds, sealed at the top with air holes. The 2 long-range operatives fired once each. 1 shot went into a root that grew across its path and closed over it. The other hit Izuku Midoriya in the chest at 110 meters per second and burst against skin that had gone the density of heartwood, and he didn't look at her. That was the part. He didn't look at most of them. He was watching the far end of the street, where the roof lines were, in case there was an 8th, and the 6 of them went into the brick behind him while his eyes were somewhere else. Every weapon on all 7 went at once. A knife, 3 pistols, a length of pipe, a set of knuckles, and a machete crushed inside their own housings, and the sound of it was a series of small breakages running for about 4 seconds, one after another, like ice going on a pond. Kamui Woods came around the corner at the tail of it and stopped. "Right," he said. "Sorry," Izuku said. "I did it before you got here. I should have waited." "Should you," said Kamui Woods, and sat down on the curb. 6 of them said nothing at all. 6 of them had been briefed on what to do if it went this way, and the brief was silence, and they held it, hanging off a brick wall 4 meters up in the rain with their arms out. The 7th talked. Her name was Sakuma, and she was 24, and she had joined the organization in September because a man in a bar had explained her own life to her better than she had ever managed to, and she had spent 11 weeks believing in it. She hung there and watched a 15-year-old immobilize 6 professionals without once looking at them the way people look at threats. Without contempt, without fear, without the specific ugly attention that she had received from every hero she had ever met in a fight. And it took her apart faster than anything anybody could have said to her. "There's a mountain," she said. Izuku's head came around. "There's a mountain, and he's woken it up, and it walks, and it's coming north." she said. That's the thing you keep looking at the ground about. That's what it is. And I want it on the record that I said it because there's a hospital on the list. Which hospital? I don't know. There's a list. I've seen the list. There's a hospital on it and a convoy. And she stopped and swallowed. There's your school. Izuku Midoriya walked over and stood in front of her and looked up. Thank you, he said, and he meant it so entirely that she started to cry. Thank you. You've just saved people. I don't know how many yet, but it's people, and it's because of you, and I want you to know that's what you did tonight. He put a hand up and held the root at her wrist. Is that too tight? I can do it looser. You're going to be in it about 9 minutes. It's fine, said Sakuma, sobbing. Kamui Woods walked home rather than take the train, and he called his mother, and when she asked why he was calling at 11:40 on a weeknight, he said, I just wanted to hear you. And she said, are you all right, Shinji? And he looked up at a streetlight with rain going through it and said, yeah, there's a kid, I'll tell you sometime. The Paranormal Liberation Front moved on the 9th of February at 2:04 in the afternoon, and it was not a raid. There were 3 targets, and they were struck inside the same 11 seconds, which required more coordination than any villain operation in the history of the country, and which had taken 4 months to plan. At Aichi Central, a 9-story civilian hospital with 190 beds, 70 staff, and a pediatric wing on the 4th floor, 12 warp gates opened at the perimeter, and Gigantomachia came through a residential block from the south at a walk at kilometer 41 of the Tomei Expressway. A UA-escorted convoy of 11 buses carrying 406 displaced civilians out of the Fukuoka zone was hit from both ends at once by 40 operatives. And at UA itself, Shigaraki Tomura came out of a gate in the western field with 160 behind him and put his hand on the wall. He had done the math with real care. He had spent 4 months on it. 3 simultaneous strikes at maximum separation, each one requiring a full national response against a hero force that had 111 active pros within useful range and a response doctrine built entirely on triage. There was no configuration in which they covered all 3. He had run it 11 ways. The best outcome for the heroes was that they saved 2 of the 3 and lost the 3rd completely. And he had made sure the 3rd would be the hospital, because the hospital was the one with the children in it, and because he wanted the country to have to watch itself choose. He had counted every hero in Japan. He had counted them one at a time, by name, with their quirks and their travel times and their limits, and he had done it correctly. And he came out one short because there was no line on his sheet for what was standing on the UA slope at 2:04 in the afternoon with both palms in the grass and its eyes shut. The hospital went first, and for 12 minutes it was as bad as anything in the modern record. Gigantomachia came up out of the south end of the district, and the district went with it. The creature was 6 stories of muscle and hide, and it did not attack the buildings. That was the horror of it. It walked, and the buildings were in the way. And a walk that displaces 500 tons doesn't have to swing at anything. 2 apartment blocks came down in its first 90 seconds. It went through the roof of a shopping arcade and out the far side without changing pace. There were 11 pros on the perimeter, and they had been briefed, and they did everything correctly. Gang Orca put 4,000 kilograms of hypersonic pressure into its ear canal, and wash and backdraft went for the eyes with combined output. And Kamui Woods, who had come down from Musutafu in a helicopter and who had been awake for 19 hours, put every branch he had into a lattice across the north approach. The lattice broke. Gang Orca went into a bus shelter and stopped moving. Backdraft's arm broke in 2 places, and he kept working with the other one until a falling cornice took him out of the fight. And in the middle of it, 411 people came out of the front doors of Aichi Central and started running north. And then the north end of the street came apart because a piece of the arcade landed on it, and they turned around and ran back the way they had come, straight into the creature's line, because that is what people do. They don't run away from the thing. They run away from the thing they last saw. And there had been 6 seconds of everything being from every direction. The line broke at 2:16. It broke where lines actually break, which was in 3 places at once, and in the hearts of 8 or 9 specific people. A rescue team that had been holding a corridor with stretchers came out of it at a run. A young sidekick named Ide, 3 months into his license, dropped a fire extinguisher and turned around and could not make his legs do the other thing. A ward nurse with a toddler under each arm stood in the middle of the road, screaming a direction at 40 people who were already going the wrong way, and the ground shook, and it kept shaking, and the shaking had a rhythm to it because it was footsteps. And then somebody in the crowd looked east and stopped screaming. The tree line on the eastern horizon was moving. It didn't sway. That was the detail that went into every account, every interview, all 900 pages of testimony. It wasn't wind. There had been a green ridge out past the rail line all morning in the middle distance where the district's park belt ran, and now the whole of it was advancing across the city at the speed of a car. A wall of forest 60 meters high coming on in a continuous front, and the ground 300 meters ahead of the canopy was already rising in a low swell, because the roots ran under and the trees came up behind, and the swell went under a road, and the road stayed on top of it and only cracked in 2 places, because somebody was thinking about the road. Petals came off it. It was February, and there were petals in the air over Aichi at 2:17 in the afternoon. The front of the forest reached the shattered north end of the street and stopped, and out of it, walking in red lacquered armor with a crack across the chest plate and one sleeve gone, came Izuku Midoriya. The sage marks under his eyes were burning gold. He didn't run past the broken line. He walked to the front of it and turned around and put himself between 400 civilians and the thing coming up the street, and he looked at all of them. Actually looked. One sweep, faces, the nurse with the toddlers, the sidekick couldn't move, an old man on the ground with his glasses gone, and he filled his chest. "Get behind me, every one of you. I am your wall." It hit the buildings on both sides and came back doubled. It went down the length of the street and around the corner and into the hospital lobby through the broken doors. 411 people heard it, and every single one of them turned around and went the way he was pointing. And the young sidekick named ID picked up the fire extinguisher, and the nurse with the toddlers got both of them to a stairwell, and a man in a hospital gown who had been standing in the middle of the road for 40 seconds, unable to choose a direction, found that he had one. Nobody ran after that. That is in the record, in those words from 11 separate statements. Gigantomachia came up the street. It had been walking for 8 hours, and it had gone through 6 blocks, and its quirk factor was fully lit. Hide layered like slate, healing running through it so fast that Gang Orca's ear strike had already closed. It saw a thing standing in the road. It weighed 500 tons on a light day. It lowered its shoulder and charged, and the pavement went to powder in a wake behind it. And it brought an arm around from the hip that would have taken the front off the building beside it. Izuku Midoriya planted both feet. He raised his eyes to the top of the thing, all 6 stories of it, and he brought his palms together in front of his chest. Sage art. Wood. Style. True. Several thousand hands. The earth broke behind him for 200 meters. What came up out of it was not a giant. There had been a giant at the Hasaikai, 60 meters, a wooden man with a heavy brow and a set mouth, and people had thought they understood the ceiling. This was a different category of thing. It came up the way a landmass comes up. 11 stories of root and heartwood, a torso wider than the street it stood in, shoulders that put an entire neighborhood into shade in the space of a breath, and its face was a broad old carved thing with its eyes half shut, and from its sides, unfolding in rows, came arms, 10 of them. Then 30, then 100, each one the mass of a highway crane, opening out from the body in tier over tier, until the sky behind the hospital was a lattice of wooden limbs, and the light coming through them made moving shadows on 400 upturned faces. It rose behind a 15-year-old boy like something standing up from sleep. The first arm came forward over his head and closed around Gigantomachia's throat in mid-charge. The creature's own momentum did most of the damage. 500 tons went into a grip that didn't move, and the neck took all of it, and there was a sound like a ship hitting a pier. Then the second arm came in and took the right shoulder. Then the third took the left. Then 7 at once, wrapping the ribs. Then 20, pulling in from every compass point, and Gigantomachia tore one arm free with a wrench that snapped 4-meter timber like celery, and 3 arms replaced it before the pieces landed. It fought. It fought for 40 seconds, which for that creature was an eternity of being told no, and it was the most enormous physical struggle anybody watching had ever seen. The roars came up out of it in a series that broke every remaining window on the street, and it got a leg free twice, and it dragged the whole construct 11 meters north through a parked ambulance. The weight built. That was all it was in the end. Root over root, layer over layer, and every fiber of it flooded with sage energy, and the density going up, and the energy did the second thing, the thing that had killed Inomu at the USJ under 900 tons of Torigate. It went in through the hide and into the Quirk factor and started drinking. Healing halved again, quartered, gone. The whole borrowed engine of it grinding down to nothing, so that the 4 broken places in the creature's arms stayed broken. Its feet left the ground, 500 tons of it airborne, 3 meters off the earth, chest wrapped 4 layers deep, arms locked out to the sides, legs bound at the ankle and the knee by roots that had come up through the street and closed. It roared into the wood at point-blank range, and the wood took it. Izuku Midoriya looked up at it for 2 seconds. That is the thing everybody remembers, more than what came after. 2 seconds. Standing in the road in cracked armor with his hands still together, looking up at a thing that had been asleep in a mountain since before he was born, and had been woken up and pointed at a hospital, and there was something on his face in those 2 seconds that the closest camera caught and that nobody has ever wanted to describe. Then the hands closed. 100 arms pulled in every direction at once. There is no adequate account of the sound. The people who were there describe it in fragments. A long, deep crack that went on for 2 full seconds and had smaller cracks inside it. And under that, a wet noise. And under that, a note like a struck cable that was the roots going tight and finding nothing left to hold. The creature's roar stopped in the middle, not tailed off, stopped in the way a record stops. Then the arms opened, and what they had been holding went down onto the road, and the road cratered under it, and there was silence in Aichi. It lasted about 11 seconds, and it felt very long. Izuku Midoriya's hands came apart. He put his palms flat on the pavement and grew a ring of low trees around the crater in the road, close together, in a circle 9 meters across, so that nobody standing in the street would have to look at what was in it. He said something into the ground that the nearest microphone caught, and that has been transcribed 9 different ways. And the most common transcription is, "I'm sorry they woke you up." Then he stood and turned, and behind him were 11 professional heroes and about 60 rescue workers and 400 civilians who had stopped running 12 minutes ago because a boy told them to. And none of them said anything at all. For what the footage confirms is 34 seconds. He wiped his face with his forearm. "There's a 4th floor pediatric ward," he said. "There's a stairwell out on the north side, but the north side's gone. So I'm going to build you one on the east, and it's going to be a ramp because 2 of your patients are on ventilators. Is that all right?" Nobody answered. "Is that all right?" he said again, to the nurse with the toddlers, because she was the nearest person with a lanyard. "Yes," said the nurse. The ramp took 9 seconds. It came out of the ground and up the eastern face of Aichi Central in a broad spiral with a railing on the outside edge, and it stopped level with the 4th floor window, and he grew a landing there, wide enough for 4 stretchers abreast, and then he grew a second ramp on the northwest corner because the surgical floor was on 6. And then he put a lattice under the sagging corner of the arcade roof 2 streets over because there were people underneath it, and then he took a breath and turned his head northeast, and his eyes changed. "Sensei," he said, into the radio taped inside his collar. "Are they at the convoy yet?" Aizawa's voice came back with wind noise all over it. 8 minutes out. The buses are pinned at 41. There's an inversion quirk in there. We can't get airborne assets over. I've got it. Midoriya. I've got it, Sensei. I planted seeds under the Tomei in October. He put both hands on the ground and did the thing that appears in the commission's file. as the single most difficult technique performed by any individual in the history of the classification system, and which he never afterward described as difficult, and which he did while standing in a ruined street with his back to a hospital. He split himself 3 ways. Not clones. He'd never had the trick of that, and he said so cheerfully to anybody who asked. What he did instead was reach into a seed bed he had laid 4 months earlier at 3 meters depth under a stretch of the Tomei Expressway and under the southern half of UA's campus. And he woke it, and he drove it, and he held all of it at once from a road in Aichi, with the sage marks burning and his nose beginning to bleed. At kilometer 41 of the Tomei, the road grew a forest. 11 buses full of displaced families sat pinned between 2 blockades with 40 operatives working down the line. And the fastest of them had got as far as the 4th bus and was 3 meters from the door when the asphalt on both sides of the carriageway opened and a wall came up. It came up on both flanks at once, 30 meters, close grown, and then it came over the top in an arch and closed, and 11 buses were inside a wooden tunnel with the doors sealed and root plates over the windows, and every one of the 40 operatives outside it was suddenly standing in a forest in the dark with roots coming out of the ground around their ankles. They lasted 4 minutes. Not because it took 4 minutes to bind them, that took under 2, but because they were spread over 1,100 meters of highway, and the last 3 had run. At UA, the western field grew a wall. Shigaraki Tomura's opening move had been to put his hand on the perimeter and let the decay run, and had run. 300 meters of wall and 2 outbuildings went to gray powder in 11 seconds, and 160 operatives came in over the crumbling line. And there were 490 students on that campus. And Nizu had begun the evacuation at 2:04, and it was going to take 9 minutes. They got 11 meters onto the grass, then the seedbed woke, and the whole southern half of UA's grounds stood up. There were 340 of them, dormant since October, and they came up as trees, and then the trees put out roots, and the roots made a mesh at knee height across 4 hectares, and then out of the mesh. At points he had chosen in advance because he had been walking that campus for a year thinking about this exact afternoon. 40 golems rose to 9 meters and started walking. They were rough. They had no faces. They didn't need faces. They waded into 160 operatives, and they didn't tire, and they didn't slow, and every part of them that got broken off grew back inside 4 seconds, and the fighting on UA. Western Field lasted 6 minutes and produced 11 hospitalizations and 0 deaths and 153 villains bound to the same 300 meters of wall. Aizawa Shota, who had been running for the Western Field with his capture weapon up, arrived to find it over. Ibara Shiozaki, who had been at the head of the class evacuation with 2 first years under one arm, and Eri Chisaki's hand in her other, stopped at the top of the ridge and looked down at 40 wooden giants walking through a battle in absolute silence, and understood, with a lurch that took her breath, that he was doing this from 180 kilometers away, and that he was standing in the middle of the worst of it while he did it, and that there was blood coming out of his nose right now and nobody there to wipe it. Her vines went so tight around her own arms that they left marks for 3 days. "He's here," she said. "He's in Aichi," said Aizawa. "He's here," said Ibara Shiozaki, and Aizawa looked at the 40 golems and shut his mouth. Shigaraki Tomura stood on the UA field and looked at his invasion coming apart. He had planned every part of this, and he had planned it well, and he stood in it with his hands out and watched 340 trees turn a strategic operation into a gardening problem. And then he made the only decision available to a man in that position, which was to go and find the pillar. He put his hand on the ground. The decay went out from him in a wave and took 9 golems and 40 meters of root mesh and 11 trees, and everything inside a 50-meter circle went to powder, and he walked through the middle of it toward the eastern gate, and every step he took made another circle, and the trees came back behind him, and he did not care because he wasn't clearing ground. He was announcing an address. He went out through the gate and into the ruined suburb beyond it, and he decayed 6 city blocks in 9 minutes, working outward, taking apart every wooden thing that grew into the space he cleared. 3 more golems, 2 root walls, a stand of ceiling trees that came up out of the pavement in a ring around him and went to gray dust in 4 seconds. And when he had a clearing 400 meters across in the middle of a district that had been houses that morning, he stopped and spread his arms and stood in it. He waited 11 minutes. The forest came from the west at 2:51. It came the way it had come at the hospital, in a front, with the ground swelling ahead of it, and it stopped at the edge of the clearing all the way around, a wall of green closing the circle, 60 meters high, and every leaf of it still. Izuku Midoriya walked out of it. The armor was worse than it had been an hour ago. The chest plate had a crack all the way across, and the right pauldron was gone. There was blood dried from his nose to his chin, and more of it in the collar of his undershirt, and the marks under his eyes were burning gold, and he was eating a rice ball out of one hand as he came, which he finished and pocketed the wrapper of. Shigaraki Tomura had thought about this for 4 months. He had a great deal to say. "I told you I would deal with you." Shigaraki's arms came down. There was no heat in it. That was the whole of the effect. It was the tone of a man who had written the ending 3 months ago and was now going through the formality of the last few pages. Flat, settled, mildly occupied with something else, the exact tone he had used in a wet alley in Hosu City, with a katana in pieces at his feet and a paralyzed classmate crying on the ground behind him. "You didn't come for me then," said Shigaraki. "I was busy," Izuku said. Then the ground went. There is no adequate footage of the next 4 minutes. 3 drones went in and came out as debris. What exists is one long shot from a news helicopter at 1,100 meters, and what it shows is a 400-meter circle of ground cycling. Living forest, gray ruin, living forest, gray ruin, in overlapping waves, at a rate of about 1 full exchange every second and a half for 240 seconds. Neither of them threw a punch. That was the part that unnerved the professionals. Shigaraki's decay went out in arcs, wide sweeps of it, both hands, and it was fast, and his radius had been rebuilt to 50 meters, and he used all of it, and everything it touched went to powder in rings, trunks the width of a car, root walls, entire groves, the road, the foundations of houses, a water main that vented a white plume 40 meters up, and then went to grit in the air. He was tremendous at it. He had been remade for exactly this. And there was nothing in the country that could have stood in that circle with him and lived. And Izuku Midoriya grew it back. Every meter of decay got 10 meters of answer. A grove came apart, and 2 groves came up out of the same soil at twice the density. A root wall crumbled, and the crumbs went into the ground, and something came up through the ash of them in 4 seconds. He walked forward the entire time, at a steady pace, hands moving in short shapes at his chest, and behind him the world knitted, and in front of him it kept coming to pieces, and the 2 of them closed the distance between them, a meter at a time over 4 minutes across ground that was being unmade and remade under both their feet. At 60 meters, Izuku dropped the wood dragon into the clearing, and Shigaraki decayed 40 meters of it, and the remaining coil got a grip on his left leg, and he had to take the leg apart at the ankle to get it back, which he did, and which grew back on him in 9 seconds because All For One had built him to survive things like that. At 30 meters, Shigaraki got both hands on the ground and put out everything he had, a full radius pulse, and every wooden thing in the circle went at once. Every trunk, every root, every golem, the whole 400 meters. And for 1.5 seconds, there was nothing standing in that district except 2 people and a great deal of gray dust hanging in the air. Then the dust settled on bare earth, and the bare earth split in 300 places. At 4 meters, Shigaraki Tomura got his hand on Izuku Midoriya's arm. He got it flat on the forearm, palm and all 5 fingers, and he held it there, and the decay went into it. The bark went first. The outer layer of sage-hardened wood grain crumbled off the arm in flakes and then in sheets. And under it, the decay found live wood, and it ate through 11 millimeters of that in under a second and touched something wet. And then the arm grew back through it. Fiber came up out of the ruin from underneath, threading through the crumbling layer while the crumbling was still happening. Live wood, then grain, then bark, then skin over the top of the bark in 4 seconds, with Shigaraki's hand still on it, pushing his own hand outward as it filled in. The two of them stood in a ruined suburb 4 meters apart and looked at that arm. Shigaraki Tomura had spent his life on one idea, and the idea was that everything comes apart if you touch it long enough. He had believed it about buildings, and he had believed it about people, and he had believed it about a society. And he had been right about all three, and he stood in the wreckage of 6 city blocks with his hand pressed against a 15-year-old's forearm and watched the arm win. "You can't decay something that regrows faster than the spread," Izuku said, and there was nothing gentle in his voice at all. He took the hand off his arm with his other hand, gently, the way you take a hand off a door frame. Wood style, smothering bind. Roots came out of every surface in a 20-meter radius at once. They came out of the earth and out of the standing walls, and out of the shells of 2 cars, and out of the pipes under the street. And they converged, and the density began to build, and the building never stopped. Shigaraki destroyed the first layer in half a second, and there were 3 behind it. He destroyed those, and there were 9. He was inside a closing sphere, and the sphere was growing faster than his radius could clear it, and every layer that formed was flooded with sage energy. And the energy went in through his skin and found the thing All for One had built into him. Because that was the engine in the end. That was the entire investment, a regenerative architecture threaded through every system in his body, a healing factor stacked 11 quirks deep, designed to hold him together through anything the world could put into him. It was the most expensive thing his master had ever made. Sage energy is natural energy, and natural energy will run into anything that is alive and will keep running until the thing that is alive can hold no more. 45 seconds. The healing hit saturation at 31 and reversed at 38, the mechanism turning inward, the whole borrowed structure of it firing on tissue that had nothing left to give it, and the roots kept coming, and the density kept climbing, and at 45 seconds, Shigaraki Tomura stopped destroying them. The sphere came apart from the inside out and went back into the ground. He was lying on his back in the middle of it, in the rubble, in what was left of a coat, and the decay had stopped. There was ash on his face, and there was blood in his mouth and his hands. Both of them lay open on the concrete with the fingers slack. He was looking up. There was a canopy over that street. It had come up in the last 4 minutes, and it was 60 meters high and full of leaves he had never seen the shape of. And the light coming down through it was green, and it moved. Izuku Midoriya crouched down beside him. He put one hand flat on the concrete, the way he had in a hallway at UA 9 months earlier with a different boy under him. And he looked at Shigaraki Tomura's face for a while. "You spent your whole life learning how to take things apart," he said. "I spent mine learning how to make things grow. Look at which one of us is still standing." There was no triumph in it. There was nothing in it at all except the flat sound of a man saying a thing that had always been true, out loud once, so that it would have been said. Shigaraki's eyes came over to him. He tried to speak. What came out had the shape of a question in it and no words, and it might have been a name, and it might have been anything, and the boy leaning over him listened to the whole of it, and then nodded once, as if it had been a full sentence and he had understood it. "I know," Izuku said. "You didn't get to be anything else. Somebody made sure of that." His hand came up off the concrete and rested on the man's shoulder. "That's the part I'm sorriest about." Then he did what the war needed done. He did it with one hand, and he did it in under a second, and there was nothing enormous about it. No construct, no giant, no 40-meter anything. A single root came up out of the concrete under Tomura Shigaraki's spine through the base of the skull and stopped, and the whole body went loose all at once in the way that bodies do, and the root withdrew and closed the ground behind it. The sound of it was very small. That was the worst thing about it, and it is in the record because Izuku Midoriya insisted the record be complete. It was a small, wet sound, and then nothing, in the middle of 6 city blocks that had been houses that morning, under a canopy that was 9 minutes old. He stayed there for a while. He put both hands on the ground on either side of the body, and he cried without making any noise at all, which nobody who knew him would have recognized because everything about him came out loud and this didn't. Then he grew a low bank of white flowers over the concrete from the shoulders down because there was going to be a photographer within 20 minutes, and he had decided in an alley in Hosu 9 months ago what kind of person he was going to be about that. He got up. He wiped his face with the back of a wrist and made it worse. "Sensei," he said into the radio, "it's finished here. Aichi's holding, the convoy's sealed, the campus is clear. I'm going to need somebody to come and take him." He looked around at 400 meters of leaves, and I'm going to need about 6 hours with the district because there's a water main under here I've grown over, and I have to go back in and fix it properly. There was a long pause on the channel. "Copy," said Aizawa Shota, in a voice that came out slightly wrong. Ibara Shiozaki reached him at 3:31 on foot in her costume, with her vines dragging in the ash. She had come 6 kilometers on the ground because the aerial corridor was shut, and she had come past 3 checkpoints by simply walking through them. And she came in under the new canopy at the eastern edge of the clearing and found him sitting on a piece of somebody's front step with his forearms on his knees. She crossed the last 30 meters at a run and went down on her knees in front of him and put both hands on his face. That was the first thing. Before anything, before a word, before the questions, before the 400 things she had rehearsed in 6 kilometers of running, her thumbs went to the skin under his eyes and pressed, checking, because she had learned in 11 months exactly what those marks looked like when they came in and exactly what they looked like when they had been up too long. And she had spent an hour and a half with the certain knowledge that he had held sage mode across 3 prefectures for the better part of it. The marks were fading. They were thinner than she had ever seen them, and there were broken vessels around them, little red threads across the whites of both eyes, and his skin was hot enough that she pulled her hands back a centimeter and then put them straight back. "They're going down," she said. "They're going down. Look at me." She turned his face. "How much?" "All of it," he said. "There's about nothing left. I've got maybe one more." He stopped and thought about it honestly, at which she loved him for. "I've got one more big one in me, and then I need to eat about 9 dinners and sleep for a day, and then I'll be fine, because it comes back, Ibara. It always comes back. It's the ground. It's got no bottom." She pulled his head forward and put her forehead against his and held it there, and both of her hands stayed on his jaw, and neither of them said anything for 11 seconds. Her vines had come all the way around him. They had done it on their own, 3 of them, one over each shoulder and one at his waist, and they were tight enough to be felt, and she made no attempt at all to correct them. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." "You said you would because of a pond." "It's a very good pond," said Izuku Midoriya, and started crying, and she let him with her forehead against his, in the middle of 6 ruined blocks under a forest that was 2 hours old. Aizawa Shota arrived at 4 and stood in the clearing for a long time. He had walked in from the south through the tree line, over root plates the size of tennis courts, past 3 golems that were still standing where they'd stopped because nobody had told them anything, and he came out into a green space 400 meters across, with sunlight coming down in bars, and 153 villains bound in a wall 6 blocks away, and a low bank of white flowers on the concrete, and 2 students sitting on a front step with their hands together. He put his braced arms in his pockets, which took some doing, and looked at it. There had been 6 city blocks here. He had been through this district in August on an evacuation drill. There had been a convenience store on that corner and a bicycle shop with a hand-painted sign, and there was a park 2 streets north where somebody's grandmother fed cats. There was a forest here now, and it would be here in 90 years. And in the middle of it, there was a boy who had eaten 4 rice balls since 2 o'clock in the afternoon and was going to sit up all night reinforcing a water main so that it wouldn't fall on anybody later. He took out his notebook. He looked at it. He put it back in his pocket without opening it. Unji Todoroki came through the tree line from the north at 20 past 4 with a burned down one arm and half of the Fukuoka flank behind, and he stopped at the edge of the clearing, and he did not say a single word for 10 minutes. He was the #1 hero. He had been an active professional for 22 years. He had a habit of speech at scenes, an assessment habit, a running commentary he had used on 1,100 incidents to establish command and calibrate his people, and it had never once failed to arrive. He stood in a forest in a suburb of Musutafu, 10 minutes, in silence. Then he walked over to the boy on the step and stopped in front of him, and Izuku Midoriya scrambled to his feet and started apologizing for the state of the district. "Sit down," said Endeavor. Izuku sat down. Endeavor looked at him for a while longer. Then he took off his own coat, which was scorched and enormous and weighed about 9 kilograms, and put it around a 15-year-old's shoulders, and turned around and walked back into the trees and gave 4 hours of orders on the northern perimeter without once mentioning what he had done. The country spent 3 days in a condition that nobody has ever properly named. There were 17 conflicting articles by Wednesday morning and 40 by Wednesday night. There were 2 special sessions. There was a memorial announcement and a casualty list that ran to 11 names, all of them heroes, none of them civilians. And a nation that had watched Aichi Central on live television at 2:16 in the afternoon read the number 0 in the civilian column and did something collective and strange and enormous with it. The forum discourse generated its own weather. A hashtag ran for 60 hours. 4 separate petitions asked for 4 separate things. One television panel spent an hour discussing whether the word hero was now inadequate, and a man on it said the word deity out loud and was gently taken off the air. And on the 3rd day, somebody leaked the UA campus surveillance feed from the garden behind Building B, and the argument stopped. It is 9 minutes long. It has no audio for the first 4 minutes. And then somebody at the network overlaid audio from a groundskeeper's phone, which is why we have the fish conversation. It shows a boy on his knees in the dirt at the edge of a shallow hollow. He is in a t-shirt. There are bandages on both hands, and there is a fading pair of marks under his eyes. And he is talking to a very small girl who is sitting cross-legged beside him with her chin on her fists, and the ground in front of them is getting lower in real time, sinking in a smooth basin 6 meters across, the clay pressing itself down and outward under his palms, and then filling from the bottom with clear water out of a source nobody has ever been able to identify. But do they get cold? The girl says. They're fine when it's cold. They go down to the bottom where it's warmer, and they sit there all winter, and they don't eat anything. They just wait. For how long? Fight months, whole months. And then it gets warm and they come up. He sits back and looks at the water. You'd like them in spring. They come right up to the top when they know you. Do they know you? They will. 18 million people watched that clip in the first day. All for One watched it in a house in the hills outside Karuizawa, in a chair by a window with a cup of tea going cold beside him, and he watched it 11 times. He had spent 3 days making a decision. He had been at a remove for 2 years, and the remove had been the whole of his method, the version of himself in Tartarus, breathing and eating and insulting the guards on schedule, the original sitting in a chair in the mountains, watching the country through a boy's eyes and 40 other pairs, spending nothing, risking nothing. It had worked. It had worked so well that not one person in the government had a file with his actual location in it, and he could have sat in that chair for another 11 years and rebuilt everything twice. He had felt the investment fall on Monday afternoon at 12 minutes past 3. It had come through the connection like a light going out in a house across a valley. And now he sat in a chair and watched a 15-year-old boy talk to a child about fish, 3 days after that child's classmates were nearly killed. And the largest single force ever assembled against the Japanese state was disassembled by one person in under half an hour. And he understood 2 things at once. The first was that the boy would keep growing. The second was that there was no version of the future in which this was allowed to continue, and All for One survived it, and that the remove, the beautiful, patient, unspendable remove, had become the most expensive thing he owned. He made the decision on the third evening, and he made it with real clarity, because he had never once in his long life lied to himself about a threat, which is the whole reason he had lasted. He put on a suit. He came at night, alone, with nothing. The UA evacuation site had become a small city over 3 weeks. 400 displaced families from Ichi and Fukuoka in tents and prefabs on the eastern athletics field, and a great many wooden structures because a boy had walked through it on the first night and asked 11 questions and then built a bathhouse, a covered walkway, 3 storage sheds, a kitchen with a roof that didn't leak, and a set of steps down the bank because an old woman had been struggling with the slope. There were 900 people asleep in it. At 11:40 on the 9th of March, all for one walked up the access road to the outer gate in a gray suit, past 2 police officers who never afterward remembered seeing him. And he stopped in the open ground inside the fence where the gravel gave way to grass. And he stood there and announced himself. He did it out loud. He said his own name, the old one, the one out of the files, and then he said it again, and there was enough contempt in the act to fill a valley, and enough respect underneath the contempt to fill a second one, because he had come here to be known by the person he had come for. The site woke up in about 90 seconds. Izuku Midoriya was sitting on a step outside the kitchen with Eri Chisaki asleep across his lap, because she had come to find him at 9 and had refused 4 separate offers of a bed. He heard it. He heard the name go across the site the way fire goes through grass, and he sat still for 4 seconds with his hand on a sleeping child's back, and then he stood up with her, both arms, one under the legs, one behind the shoulders, the way he had stood up with her once before in the rubble of her own house, and he crossed to where Ibara Shiozaki was already standing in the doorway, with her hair loose and her vines gone rigid. He put Eri into her arms. Eri. He got down so his face was at her level, and he waited until she was awake enough to see him. Hey, look at me. I've got to go and do something, and it's going to be loud. And I need you to go with Ibara and stay with her the whole time, and I need you to know 2 things. He smiled at her, and it was a real one, all the way up into his eyes. The first thing is that nothing out there is coming into this building. The second thing is that I'll be back before the fish. Okay, said Eri. Say it back to me. Nothing's coming in, she said, and you'll be back before the fish. That's it exactly. He kissed the top of her head and stood and looked at Ibara Shiozaki over the child's shoulder for 1 full second, and there was an entire conversation in that second that neither of them ever repeated to anybody. Then he went out and found Aizawa on the gravel. Keep everyone back, he said. I mean everyone. This is mine. Aizawa Shota, who had spent 11 months trying to find a liver, looked at him and found at last that there was one thing he could do, and that it was this. Everyone back, he said, and turned and began giving the orders. Izuku Midoriya walked out through the gate onto the open ground. 50 meters of grass. A man in a gray suit at the other end of it, hands folded in front of him, standing in the light spill from the site's floods. He looked ordinary. That was the thing everybody who ever met him said. He looked like a man who managed a mid-sized company and had a wife and a season ticket. And he stood on UA's eastern approach at 20 to midnight and looked across the grass at a 15-year-old in a t-shirt with dirt on his knees. And he looked at him with the attention of a man who has been studying photographs of a mountain for 6 months and has finally come to the valley to see it. You're smaller than the footage suggests, he said. Everybody says that. I imagine everybody does. He unfolded his hands. I've met 8 one-for-all bearers. I killed 6 of them. I've broken the best fighters this country produced before your mother was born, and I built the boy you put in the ground on Monday, and I have never in 190 years walked towards something the way I walked up that road tonight. He tilted his head. Do you understand what a compliment that is? I think so, Izuku said. I doubt it. Let me try a different one. He took 2 steps forward on the grass. I want you. Then he talked for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and it was the best thing he had ever done. He had gathered followers for 100 years, and he knew, with total accuracy, what to say to each kind of person. And he had spent 3 days working out which kind this was, and he had it right. He didn't offer power. He understood immediately that offering power to this boy would be like offering water to a river. He offered scale. He talked about the hospital in Aichi. He named it. He said the number 411, and he said it correctly. And he asked whether the boy had noticed how close it had been. 12 minutes, he said. 12 minutes. And in the 12th minute, a nurse in that street had made a decision about which two children to put down, and had put one down and had gone back for her and had been lucky. He said, there are 1,100 hospitals in this country. He said, there are 126 million people, and you have one pair of hands and a train timetable. He talked about the rot. He was excellent on the rot because he had built most of it. He laid out the commission, the licensing structure, the rankings, the sponsorship money, the way the whole edifice had been designed to keep power distributed and legible and therefore weak. And he said with genuine feeling, their genuine feeling, drafting a category for you, boy. Do you know what a category is? It is a fence with a name on it. And then he came to the question and he asked it plainly, and it was the right question, and both of them knew it. Can you protect everything you love, said All for One, everywhere, at every moment, for the rest of your life? He spread his hands. You are one person. You will sleep. You will be in Hokkaido when it happens in Okinawa. You will be 41 years old with a bad back and 3 children, and it will happen anyway, somewhere to somebody you would have died for, and you will hear about it on the radio. He let that sit. Unless the ground itself belongs to us, unless there is a hand on every acre. I can give you that. I am the only thing that has ever existed that can give you that. And I am standing on the grass asking, which I have never done for anyone. He finished. He put his hands back together in front of him. Are you big enough for the job? He said. Or would you like to be? Izuku Midoriya stood across 50 meters of grass and had listened to every single word. That was the thing All for One noticed, and it was the last new thing he ever learned about a human being. The boy had listened. Properly, with his whole face turned toward him, the way almost nobody does. He had gone through 4 minutes and 11 seconds of the most persuasive speech of a 100-year career, and he had taken all of it in, and his expression at the end of it was the expression of someone who has been given something serious to consider and has considered it. Thank you for asking me, Izuku said. You're welcome. I mean it. You came here yourself and you said it to my face and you didn't send anybody, and that's... He nodded once. That's more than you gave him, so thank you. Then he said, the roots remember every life. Everyone. Count them. All for One went still. The earth under this city carries the memory of everyone you took from it, Izuku said. Every person you emptied out and put down. It all goes into the ground, all of it. That's where it goes. And it doesn't leave. Nothing ever leaves. It just gets pressed flat and weighted on. He brought his palms up in front of his chest. The wood I grew through the Hasaikai knows exactly what happened inside that compound. 9,000 years of root and bark and ring under this island, and every fiber of it knows your name, and I have had my hands in it since I was 6 years old. He pressed his palms together. I'm not arguing with you. I'm ending you. Wood style, deep forest emergence. Every root, every tree, every seeded thread of wood that Izuku Midoriya had grown on UA, grounds in a full year of attendance, woke up in the same instant. That was 11 months of habit. The treehouse behind the dormitory, the hedge along the third-year path, the frames of the third-floor windows he had fixed with wood after breaking them in April and never replaced, the bench on the meditation slope and the roof he'd put over it, and the plum wall under a girl's window. 4 fruit trees behind Building B, and a gravel path and a bank and a pond with a clay lining. 340 seed beds under the southern field that had already stood up once in February and had been growing since. The bathhouse, the covered walkway, the steps down the bank for an old woman with a bad hip. 6,000 individual things planted and grown and forgotten by everybody but him across 4 square kilometers. The campus became an engine. The ground went down 11 centimeters everywhere at once, all across UA, as if the whole plateau had inhaled. Then it came up. All for One's opening move was the correct one, and he made it in under a second. He took the ground, he had 130 quirks, and he had spent a lifetime learning how they combine, and he put a stolen kinetic redirect through the earth in front of him and turned 400 tons of rising root back on itself, folding the first assault into a knot that tore itself apart, and then he absorbed the second wave and used what he took from it to throw a wall of stolen matter across the approach, and he did all of that in 3 seconds while walking forward. He was magnificent. That is in the file. In the assessment section, in language, the commission argued over for a week. The subject demonstrated the highest observed level of combat competence in the recorded history of the classification system. He tore a pillar out of the ground with a quirk that had belonged to a man in Osaka in 1977, and 20 saplings came up out of the hole it left. He sent an absorption chain, a thing like a black rope of teeth made out of 4 abilities layered together, and it closed on a root and began to eat it. And the root grew around the grip and through it and past it and kept going, and the chain ended up threaded into the middle of a living trunk with nothing to bite. He used a redirect on the whole eastern grove and turned it into a wave of splinters and sent it back at 900 kilometers an hour. And it hit Izuku Midoriya standing in the middle of the grass and burst against skin that had gone the density of heartwood, and left him with 3 cuts on his cheek that closed while he was walking. He fought for 11 minutes, and he was losing measurably from the 4th, because everything he had was built for objects. That was the whole architecture of him. 130 ways to take a thing and break it or move it or eat it, and the assumption underneath all of them was that a thing, once broken, is broken. He had never in 190 years faced an opponent whose entire surface was alive and regrowing, and doing so faster than consumption could follow. He absorbed a golem, and 2 came up out of the spot where it had been standing. He turned back 40 arms, and 80 came. He blew a crater in the earth 11 meters deep, and the crater grew a forest in it from the bottom up in 9 seconds, and the trees came out of the top of the hole, taller than the ones around it. At the 11-minute mark, Izuku Midoriya brought the sage energy all the way up. The marks under his eyes went past red-brown and into gold, and the gold went out along the vessels at his temples in fine lines, and the air pressure on the eastern approach rose enough that 3 police officers 400 meters back went to their knees with their ears popping. The ground shook in a radius that put readings into monitoring stations in 3 prefectures, and the woman at Kyushu, who had once been laughed out of 2 conferences, was woken at 11:54 by an automated alert and sat on the edge of her bed with a phone in her hand and started to laugh. Sage art. Wood style, true several thousand hands. It came up out of UA's eastern field for the second time in this story, and this time there was a man in front of it and no creature. 11 stories. 100 arms. It rose behind Izuku Midoriya with the sound of an entire landscape standing up, and the floodlights of the evacuation site lit it from below and put its shadow across 400 meters of grass and up the side of the UA main building, and 900 displaced people came out of their tents to see it, and were held back at the fence by heroes who were themselves holding onto the fence. The arms came forward in rows. All for one redirected the first 40. That is the single most impressive thing any villain has ever done in this country, and it deserves to be said properly. 40 arms, each with the mass of a highway crane, converging on one man from 110 degrees of arc, and he put both hands out and took the force and turned it, using a stolen physics that had belonged to a woman who died in 1991, and he restructured the wood as it came, took the incoming tonnage and reformed it mid-flight into a wall of flechettes 9 meters wide, and threw the entire thing back down the line, 400 tons of sharpened hardwood at speed into a 15-year-old boy standing in the grass. Izuku Midoriya planted his feet and took it in the chest. He didn't move. The flechettes hit sage-hardened wood and crumbled. The first 100 of them went to powder against his forearms and his chest and his shoulders, and one went through the palm of his left hand and stopped halfway and was pushed back by the flesh closing behind it. And the rest of the wall broke apart on the ground around him and lay there smoking. And when it cleared, he was standing in the same square meter of grass with his hands coming together. All for one looked at that. He had run one calculation his entire life, every day on every person he met, and it had never been short. He stood on UA's eastern approach with his suit in ruins and his breath coming hard for the first time in 100 years, and he ran it, and it came up short, and he understood. Hokage style, Elder Jutsu, 10th Edict on Enlightenment. The pressure wave came from everywhere, out of the ground and out of the canopy and out of the root network under 4 square kilometers and out of the air itself, a resonant note at the absolute ceiling of sage output, one sustained frequency propagating through every living thing on that campus at once, and it went into all for one and found the joins, because that was what he was made of. Joins. 130 stolen abilities, bonded, layered, welded onto one another across 19 decades, every one of them grafted into a place it hadn't grown, and the whole structure held together by the fact that nothing had ever hit all of it simultaneously. The note propagated through him the way a sustained note propagates through glass, and he could not hold them. They came apart in sequence. The oldest first. A strength quirk taken in 1889 from a stevedore in Yokohama went out of him like a tooth coming loose, and then a quirk for stopping bleeding, and then air propulsion, and then 11 at once, and then 30. And then it was a cascade, the whole accumulation of 190 years, unraveling from the bottom up while he stood in the grass with his hands out trying to hold his own life together by main force. He went to one knee at 11:58. He came back up. He got about halfway on one leg with everything in him, and then the last of it went, and he went down again and stayed. The construct settled. It went back into the earth in silence over about 40 seconds, the arms folding in and sinking, the great head going down under the field, and the roots withdrew from 4 square kilometers of campus and the ground. The ground came back to stillness, and the leaves stopped moving, and there was almost nothing left standing on the eastern approach except 2 people and a great deal of new forest. Izuku Midoriya walked across the grass. He came and stood over a man on one knee in a ruined suit. A man whose face, for the first time in 19 decades, was the face of somebody who had run his sums and found them short. And he looked down at him. All for one got his head up. "I have been," he said, and had to stop and start again. "I have been alive for 190 years, and I have never," he breathed. "What are you?" "I'm from Musutafu," Izuku said. He knelt down. He did it so their faces were level, which was a habit, and which was, at that moment, the most terrible thing he could have done. "I didn't do this for the world," he said. "I did it for the people in that building behind me. Every single one of them." His voice didn't move at all. "There's a woman in the 3rd prefab who's 91 and she can't manage the bank, so I put steps in. There's a boy in the 2nd row of tents who won't sleep unless the light's on, so his tent has a light in it that grows. There's a girl asleep in the kitchen block who spent 900 days under a ceiling, and I promised her nobody would ever put a roof between her and the sky again, and you came up that road tonight." He put one hand flat on the ground beside the man's knee. "That's the only calculation I've ever run. That's all this ever was." Then he ended it. He did it the way he had done it in a ruined suburb 3 weeks earlier, with one root, and it took less than a second, and there was almost nothing to it at all. The body came apart from the ground up and went into the earth, and the earth closed over it, and the grass came in across the market left in about 9 seconds. And it was ordinary grass, the same grass as the rest of the field, and by morning nobody could find the spot. There was silence on UA's eastern approach for a while. Then a bird started, somewhere up in the new canopy over the athletics field. It was 2 minutes past midnight in March, and it was a Japanese bush warbler, out of season, 3 months early, and it made the 2-note call that they make, and then made it again, because it always does. That is the thing about the ground. You can put anything into it at all, and 30 seconds later, something in the branches will start up as if it were the beginning of a morning, and it will be right. Izuku Midoriya sat down on the grass and put his face in his hands. At the perimeter, 111 heroes and 900 civilians stood at a fence and looked at a field. Aizawa Shoda put his hands in his pockets and looked at the tree line for a long moment without saying anything at all. Then he ducked the tape and walked out across the grass alone and sat down beside his student and stayed there for 11 minutes without a word, which was the entire content of everything he had ever wanted to say to him. Ibara Shiozaki stood at the edge of the trees with one hand over her heart. Her eyes were clear. Her vines had gone loose down her back and were drifting. She had made her peace with what he was a long time before this. Somewhere between a hallway with a broken corridor in it and a rooftop in Nagoya, in 100 small conversations on a hillside, and she had done the work of it honestly, kneeling on a floor in the small hours more than once, with her hands together, asking the question and waiting for it. She had asked whether it was permissible to love a person who did this. She had asked it 4 ways, and she had received the same answer every time, which was the answer she had brought into the room with her, and which was this. She would rather have a boy with bark under his skin and the weight of 9,000 years in his hands than any version of a world in which those hands were absent from it. She stood at the tree line and watched him sit on the grass with his teacher, and she waited for him to be ready. And she went out to him when he was. Eri Chisaki watched from the kitchen block window with Eijiro Kirishima's hand on her shoulder. She was 6 years old, and she had been to look away twice and had declined both times. And she saw a mountain of arms rise up out of a school field and go back down again. And she saw a man in a suit on one knee in the grass. And she saw a boy kneel down so their faces would be level. She didn't have any words for it. She turned around and went back into the room where she slept and sat down on the bed in front of a small knot of wood with a hollow center that had 11 leaves in November and 40 by March, and she looked at it for a long time. She would not have words for it until she was about 22, and when she got them, she would be standing in a lecture hall being asked a question by somebody who had never met him, and the words she would use were, "He never once made me watch him be big." The commission filed its recommendation 3 weeks later. It was 12 pages. It took 7 days of internal argument to agree on the language, and the argument became, at one point, a shouting match in a room with government auditors in it. Kubo, the chair, went home on the 5th night and told his wife he was going to resign, and she made him a bowl of noodles and said, "You won't," and he didn't. What they produced proposed, in the most official language available to the Japanese state, that Izuku Midoriya be considered for a designation that did not currently exist in hero law and would have to be created by statute, a standing category acknowledging that the individual in question constituted in himself a component of the nation's disaster response capacity, its physical infrastructure, and its strategic deterrent, and that no existing framework of licensing, oversight, deployment, or duty of care was adequate to any part of that. The phrase they landed on after 9 drafts was living civic infrastructure. Nobody on the commission was fully comfortable with it. Kubo attached a personal note to the cover, 1 paragraph long, which is now framed in the Diet Library, and which ends, "The subject is 15 years of age. I ask the reader to hold both of those facts at once, as we have been required to. He was 15. He had sealed a tectonic fault at 6. He had pulled a criminal empire out of the earth, held a national invasion at 3 points at once, and removed from the world the largest single threat to human life in the modern era, and he had done the last 2 inside 4 weeks, and apologized to a municipal engineering office between them. Nezu received the document on a Friday and read it in 9 minutes. Then he telephoned the commission's secretariat and said, with impeccable pleasantness, 'I'll ask him,' and put the receiver down before anybody could establish what that meant. Izuku read it in Nezu's office on the Monday with his knees together and his hands in his lap, and it took him half an hour because he read the footnotes. 'That's rude,' he said. 'I thought you might feel that way.' He thought about it for a while, turning a page back and forth. 'But fair,' he said. He read a bit more. He got to the section on deployment authority and his eyebrows went up, and he read it twice and set the whole thing down on his knee. 'Can I still go to school?' he said. 'Yes,' said Nezu. 'Okay then,' said Izuku Midoriya. The world was different afterward in the ways that mattered, and the ways that mattered were mostly invisible. There had been an architecture of dread holding up the whole of hero society for as long as anybody working in it had been alive, an assumption never stated in a training manual and present in every single one of them, that there were things which could not be stopped and could only be survived. Every doctrine had been built on top of that assumption. Every triage protocol, every ranking structure, every one of the 900 small compromises that a commission makes when it believes in its bones that the worst thing is coming and cannot be beaten. The foundation came out from under all of it in 4 weeks, and the building above it took 2 years to come down, and it came down slowly and clumsily and to a great deal of complaint, and something better got built in the space. And that is a whole other story and mostly involves committees. What the country had instead was a forest where 6 city blocks used to be. UA held the memorial 3 months after the war in June on the site. The forest had been named by then. The name came out of the neighborhood rather than out of an office. People had started calling it after the street that used to run through the middle of it, and the city council had held a session about a more suitable name and had then, to its own surprise, decided to leave it. There was a trail through it. It had been surveyed and gravelled, and it ran 1.5 kilometers from the old convenience store corner to the north end where somebody's grandmother had fed cats and where somebody's grandmother now fed cats under a canopy 60 meters high. The Nagoya site had been declared a protected structure the previous autumn because an engineering survey had concluded in writing that removing the root system was impossible. The Musatafu forest was formally incorporated into the municipal plan in April, which is the driest sentence in this entire story, and one of the most important. There is a grove at the center where the true several thousand hands rose, and it has become the specific kind of place that people come to without being told to come to it. There is no sign at the grove. There never has been. There are usually flowers, and in the second year, somebody left a bicycle bell tied to a low branch, and it is still there, and children ring it. The memorial was at 4 in the afternoon, and it was for the displaced, and for the 11 heroes on the list, and for the 6 blocks. Izuku Midoriya attended in the red lacquered armor, cleaned and reinforced, with the crack in the chest plate repaired and a new right pauldron, and for the first time since the USJ, both bracers, because Mei Hatsume had rebuilt the missing one over 4 weeks as a personal project and had presented it to him in the support workshop with a 40-minute explanation, at the end of which he had cried on it. He stood at the edge of the grove and watched people move through the trees. He wasn't performing anything. There were cameras at the perimeter, and there had been a great deal of discussion about where he should stand, and he had ignored all of it and gone and stood off the trail near a young camper with his hands behind his back and watching an old man show his grandson where the bicycle shop had been. Tenya Ida came and stood next to him and said nothing for 4 minutes, which for Tenya Ida was a feat of self-mastery on the order of a national record. "You want to say something," Izuku said eventually. "I have 11 things to say. Do you want to say them?" "I don't," said Ida, and stayed where he was, with his hands at his sides, looking at the trees. Todoroki was there. He came with his mother, which is a sentence that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier and was now unremarkable, because he had gone to see her every week for 1.5 years and had brought her home for good in April. He fought with both sides now and had for a while, and there was a persistent slight warmth in his left hand that Recovery Girl had examined twice and pronounced fine, and which he had never had before, and which he suspected had nothing to do with his quirk. He and Izuku had a friendship built almost entirely on Izuku shouting true things at him across various pieces of terrain, and Todoroki had stopped being surprised when the true things turned out to be true. "There's a tree in this grove that came out of my fire," he said. "There are about 90. There's one specific one." Todoroki nodded at it, 30 meters off, a wide cherry with a lean in it. I asked. The city forestry office measured the ring density, and there's a heat signature in the first 4 rings. They wrote a paper. They sent it to me, Izuku said, and started crying immediately. "I thought you'd want to know. Shoto, please don't hug me at a memorial." He was hugged at a memorial Katsuki Bakugo found him at the grove's edge at 5:30 when most of it was over and the light had gone long and gold through the trunks. He had something he intended to say. He'd had it for 4 months. He'd had a version of it since a broken corridor on the 4th day of the school year, and a longer version of it since a 9-leaved sapling on a fence line at ground gamma, and he had rewritten it 11 times in his head in the last week, and every version of it was too long. He stood next to him. He put his hands in his pockets and took them out again. It took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of standing there, in the gold light, with his jaw working, and Izuku Midoriya, who could feel every single thing happening in the ground under both of them, and who therefore knew exactly how fast the other boy's heart was going, did the kindest thing he had ever done, which was to keep looking straight ahead at the trees and say absolutely nothing. The bento container, Bakugo said. I kept it. He said nothing else. He turned around and walked off down the trail before there could be a response. At a pace that was a little faster than walking, with his shoulders up, Izuku Midoriya stood there and watched him go all the way to the bend. Then he turned back to the trees and cried for a completely reasonable amount of time, which is to say 11 minutes, on his own, at the edge of a grove, the way he cried at three-legged dogs and good lunches and documentaries about tide pools and the entire contents of his own life. Class 1A was around all of this, and had been the whole time. They had become the thing he kept calling them, which he had started calling them in the first week of April when it was ridiculous, and had gone on calling them until it stopped being ridiculous and became simply the name of what they were. They were loud, and they were absurd, and they were the most watched group of teenagers in the country. And they had grown over 2 years into something that people came from other prefectures to look at. They know where it came from. Every one of them knows. If you ask them about it, they get embarrassed and change the subject, which is why almost nobody asks. Kirishima Eijiro answered it once on camera at 19 in a corridor at an awards thing, and the clip is still going around. Kirishima says and stops and does that thing with his hand. Okay, he made being good feel like the most natural thing in the world. That's it. That's the whole answer. You'd be standing there thinking about doing the easy thing, and he'd come around the corner, and it wasn't like he told you off. He never told anybody off. You'd just suddenly want to do the other thing, because he was going to. Obviously, he was going to. And you wanted to be in the same room as it. He shrugs. You just wanted to be in the same room as it. Eri Chisaki was enrolled in a supervised program on the UA campus that autumn. Gentle, structured, 4 hours of lessons, and a great deal of grass. Designed by 4 people over 6 weeks with one instruction on the cover sheet, which read, "Give her a childhood. She calls him by his first name without prompting, now. She has strong opinions about breakfast, particularly on the subject of which fruits are better cold, and she will argue about it at length with a small vertical crease between her eyebrows, and the argument is one of the great pleasures of his life. She has asked for a dog 3 times. The dog question remains tabled on the grounds that he responded to the first request by growing her 3 fruit trees, which she has correctly identified in writing as not being a dog. She left a note about it on the kitchen board. It says, "These are plants. The pond in the garden behind Building B was finished in May. It is 6 meters across and is deeper than it looks, and the water is very clear, and it has a bank of iris at the shallow end and a flat stone at the deep end for sitting on. For 4 months, it contained 11 wooden fish that he had grown as placeholders while he found out how to source real ones properly, because he had read a book about it and become concerned about doing it wrong. And the wooden fish drifted around near the bottom and turned over in the current and had eyes, and the class found them both confusing and completely charming, and there was a petition to keep them when the real ones arrived. 4 of them are still in there. They live under the stone. The dock came last. It runs out over the water from the eastern edge, 3 planks wide, grown in one piece. And it is exactly long enough for 2 people to sit at the end of it with their legs over the water, which is the specification he built it to, which is the only specification it has. He took her there the evening after the memorial. The sun was going down behind Building B, and the surface of the water had gone silver. And the cherry trees along the bank were in bloom in June because they were always in bloom when he was this happy and had been for 11 days. They sat down at the end of the dock with their feet hanging over the water, and Ibara Shiozaki put her hands in her lap, and one of her vines went out along the plank on its own and reached the end of it and trailed down into the pond, entirely loose, which is the most relaxed she had been in a year and a half and which she was aware of and did nothing about. For a while, neither of them said anything, which was still, after 2 years, the language they were most fluent in. The petals came down. They came off in 2s and 3s and landed on the water and drifted, and the wooden fish came up to look at them and then went back under. Then he reached over and took her hand. The whole hand, both of his around one of hers, the way he had done in a tree on a rooftop in Nagoya at 2 a.m. with concrete dust still in his hair, and he looked out at the pond. "Peace isn't stillness," he said. "It's what grows in the place where the fighting used to be." Ibara Shiozaki looked at the water, at the petals landing and turning and drifting out. "You've been working on that line for a while," she said. "Since Hosu," he said. "I wanted it to be right before I said it." She turned her head and looked at him. He turned his head and looked at her. "It's right," she said. He grinned so wide that his eyes closed, and she watched him do it, and the light off the water moved on the underside of the cherry branches above them, and somewhere behind them across the garden, a 6-year-old was shouting about something at the top of her lungs, and further off than that, a class of loud, ridiculous, devoted people were arguing about dinner in a building he had put 3 windows and a bench and a walkway into. He opened his eyes and looked back out at the pond. He had grown it for her. It was good, and it was finished, and there were real fish in it, and 4 wooden ones under the stone, and the water came from a source nobody could identify and would still be coming in 90 years. 6 blocks east of a school in Musutafu, there was a forest with a bicycle bell in it. 180 kilometers west, there was a hospital with 2 ramps up the outside and a ring of low trees around a crater in a road. There was a mountain of concrete sitting in the branches of a 900-year-old wood in Nagoya, with a shrine at the base of the largest trunk that nobody would ever take down. The world was standing. His village was whole. The girl beside him had said she loved him in a tree on a rooftop after the hardest night of his life. And he had never once let go of her hand. That was enough. It had always been enough. He had known it was enough since he was 6 years old, with both palms flat on a road that was coming apart, crying, saying one word into the asphalt, because down there, under the concrete and the pipes and the clay, there was something huge and slow and alive that had been pushing against the inside of his hands since the day he was born, and all it had ever wanted was permission. He looked at the pond. The petals came down on the water. The roots went down 34 meters and kept going, and every fiber of them held on to everything they had ever been given. And the ground under all of it was still, the way it goes still when something enormous and immovable has decided to stand exactly where it is. Somewhere under the dock, in the dark warm clay, a seed he hadn't meant to plant cracked open and put out one white thread toward the light.
The Hero Roster. A massive salute to the legends backing this journey. Your support is what keeps the momentum at an all-time high and the dream moving forward. You guys are the absolute best. Pro Heroes, the elite front line, stepping up and setting the pace for the whole community. DA, Fire 05.
Symbol of peace. The pillars of the community. The titans who keep our foundations solid and the hype at an all-time high. Alexander Igarza. That Guy Miso. Deck. Lydell Scott Jr. James Martin. Victor Laroux. Rune Brokstad. Ariuse Bryant. Jonah Wheeler, T-Mac, XXHJRX3A7XX, Hyperbeams, Michael Murphy,
Grand Region Kell, Sin Hunter, Logan Bland, Alexander Johannes, Alex Morgan, Ray Various, That Other Guy Too, Chad Reynolds, T. Mackey 68 Rimuru, A. Zetros, Dweller of the Deepest Depths, Lone Wolf, Jacob Ropes, Bully Maguire Shadow, Rathakit Thitiratnun Thakul, Neostar Productions, Asael Cardenas, Shaquan Simmons, Thunder, Sunawin 631, Elijah Saunders, Peter Hamilton, Freddie Rose, Omega, Akuma no Akami, Remorsefuls, Black Vein, Joshua Hedrington, Aaron Abercrombie, Drift SK8ER, Corey Tokars, Jan, Devin Black, Crow, Joe Bros, Ray Von Crimson River, Dante Alastor, Adam Yonkers, Blood Saints, Donna Cafe, Zeph, KC, Howie 60, Ignacio.
Hope of the universe, the ultimate guardians, celestial tier supporters whose impact literally shines across the galaxy. Void Rot, Chaos Umbre, Noroi Uzumaki Uchiha, Tyshawn Palmer, Coldbane 4, The Maniac 563, Debs, LS Morningstar, Marl, Spintown, I Shoot X50, Greg Green, James, Q Honyen Thompson, Juan, and Zeno KJ. That's the story of the boy who made the ground itself answer. From sealing a fault line at 6 years old to standing over the most powerful villain in history and ending it with a single root. Power meant to stop the fighting every single time. If you enjoyed this one, drop a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what quirk or character you want to see Deku with next. I'll see you in the next one. Stay rooted.